Ethan tried to open his eyes and immediately regretted it. The light hit him like a slap in the face. There was something wet and cold under his cheek. A dirt floor. A spit-stained, stinking dirt floor. It smelled of rancid grease and sour mash, and something else that made his throat tighten. Like children. It smelled of unwashed children. Ethan lifted his head and saw them. Two of them. By the cold stove. A boy of about 6 and a girl of about 4. Both so thin that the veins in their necks showed through their skin. Big, dark eyes. The girl flinched and hid behind her brother's back. The boy didn't run away. The boy shielded her with his body. Not out of anger, not defiantly. With a familiar, well-rehearsed resignation. He knew it was going to hurt. He had already accepted it. Ethan looked at this 6-year-old boy shielding his sister from their own father, and something inside him snapped. It didn't break. It snapped. Like a rope that had been holding everything together. He tried to sit up. His body felt like a stranger's. Emaciated. His hands shook with a fine, alcohol-induced tremor. Everything that could hurt did. His ribs. His knees. His back. His head was buzzing, and in that buzz, unfamiliar memories floated by. Fragments. Images. A house he'd gambled away. A wife who'd died in childbirth. The funeral money drunk away in the very first week. An empty pantry. A neighbor's spit at his feet. And a name. Corvin. That was the name of the man whose body he had taken over. Ethan swallowed and nearly choked on his own breath reeking of alcohol. Corvin. A drunk. A troublemaker. A father who beat his 6-year-old son for spilling milk. Who sold his mother's cross for a jug of moonshine. Ethan closed his eyes and told himself one simple thing. Corvin isn't here anymore. He sank to his knees. Slowly, very slowly, so as not to scare him away. The boy tensed his whole body. The girl behind him stopped breathing. Ethan opened his mouth and heard his own voice. A stranger's. Hoarse. Ragged. He said his name was Dad. He said he knew they didn't believe him. He said they didn't have to. He asked for 2 days. He promised he'd feed them. He swore it. The boy was silent. He looked up from under his brows with that same gaze that held more maturity than all the men in this village put together. The girl peeked out from behind his shoulder. She asked very quietly, almost in a whisper, if he was going to yell today. Ethan turned away toward the wall, quickly, so the children wouldn't see. Tears were streaming down the 34-year-old man's face, and there was nothing he could do about it. When he pulled himself together and turned back to them, they hadn't moved. They were still sitting by the stove. The boy was still shielding his sister. Ethan looked around. A house. Though it was hard to call it a house. 4 walls of rough-hewn logs. A shingle roof through which the sky was visible in 3 places. A dirt floor. A single room. A bench. A table with a cracked top. A stove that clearly hadn't been stoked in a long time. The ashes inside were cold and gray. Ethan stood up. His head spun, and he grabbed the wall for support. His legs felt like they were made of cotton. Corvin's body was ravaged. Years of drinking had drained him of everything. His muscles were gone. His fat was gone. All that remained were bones covered in skin and trembling fingers. Ethan took a step toward the pantry. The boy flinched. Ethan stopped. He raised his hands, palms forward, showing they were empty. Then he slowly walked over to the pantry and opened the door. It was empty. Just one shelf. On it, a handful of gray salt in a rag. And that was it. Not a grain of rice, not a crumb of bread, not a single onion. Nothing. Ethan stood in front of that empty shelf and did the math. The children hadn't eaten for at least a day. Maybe longer. He turned to them. The boy's name was Tobias. The girl's was Lily. He knew this from fragments of Corvin's memory. He told them he was going outside and would be back soon. He asked them not to be afraid. Tobias didn't answer. Lily pressed herself closer to her brother. Ethan stepped out onto the porch and squinted. The sun, the fresh air, and a scene that made him want to curse out loud. A village. 20 yards, maybe 25. Half of them abandoned. Crooked fences, empty vegetable gardens overgrown with weeds. Chickens as skinny as their owners. A dusty road between the houses. No one on the road. Just an old woman by the neighboring fence. She was squinting at him. Her lips were pursed. Her gaze was like a tub of icy water. It was Martha. He knew this from Corvin's memories. A neighbor. She'd seen it all. All the drinking binges. All the shouting. All the evenings when a child's crying could be heard coming from Corvin's house. Ethan nodded at her. Martha turned away pointedly. He wasn't offended. It would have been strange if she'd smiled. Ethan stepped down from the porch and looked around more closely. A stream ran along the edge of the village. He could hear it, a quiet murmur. Willow trees grew along the banks, thick and supple, with long, straight branches. Ethan looked at the willows, and it clicked in his head. A fish trap, the simplest design. A woven basket with a funnel opening inside. The fish swim in and can't get out. One trap takes 15 minutes to make if your hands aren't shaking. His hands were shaking. So, half an hour. He went down to the stream. His legs buckled with every step. Corvin's body protested every movement. Ethan sat down on the bank and began cutting twigs with the knife he'd found on the table. A dull, rusty knife with a rickety handle. He cut and wove. His fingers wouldn't obey him. The twigs kept slipping. It took him not 15 minutes, nor 30, to make the first basket. Almost an hour. Sweat streamed into his eyes. His back ached. But by the end of that hour, a woven structure lay on the ground before him. Clumsy. Not perfect. But it worked. He started on the second one. The second went faster. The third even faster. By the end of the second hour, he had 4 sections. He placed them on the rapids, weighed them down with stones, positioned the funnels against the current. He straightened up and saw Martha. The old woman was standing by her wattle fence watching him. She clicked her tongue and shook her head. That drunkard's gone completely mad. He set out to catch fish by the basketful. Ethan said nothing. He went back into the house. The children were sitting in the same spot. They didn't move. He stoked the stove. The firewood was damp and rotten, but it caught fire somehow. Then he sat down on the floor against the wall across from the children. Not close. At a distance. Tobias watched his every move. Ethan said they'd have food in the morning. Tobias didn't believe him. You could see it in his eyes. Lily was already asleep, curled up in a ball behind her brother's back. She was clutching a piece of dry bread in her fist. Or rather, what had once been a piece of hardtack. A crumb. She held it as if it were a treasure. Ethan looked at that crumb in the child's fist and swore to himself. Silently, without words. He just swore. Morning. Ethan got up before dawn. His body ached as if he'd been beaten with sticks all night. He went out to the stream. He crouched down by the first net. He lifted it. It was heavy. A fish was thrashing inside. He shook the catch out onto the bank. 3 chub. Large ones. Silvery. Alive. The second net. 2 more chub and a crayfish. The third. 4 chub. The fourth. 2 chub and 2 crayfish. 11 fish and 3 crayfish. Ethan stood over his catch and felt a joy he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe ever. He gathered the fish in the hem of his shirt and carried them home. On the way, he noticed some wild onions by the roadside. He picked a bunch. He went into the house. The children were already awake. Tobias was standing by the door, tense, ready for anything. Lily was peeking out from behind his back. Ethan set the fish on the table, silently. Tobias looked at the fish, then at him. Something flickered in the boy's eyes. Not distrust. Not yet. Surprise. Ethan sat down to clean the fish. His hands were shaking less now. Or maybe he'd just gotten used to it. He cleaned it from tail to head, quickly, confidently. He gutted it, rinsed it in a bucket of water, put a pot on the stove, threw in the fish, wild onions, a pinch of that gray salt from the rag. Fish soup. Simple, no frills, but hot and thick. When the aroma wafted through the house, Lily stepped out from behind her brother's back. For the first time. She walked over to the table. Ethan ladled some into her bowl. She sniffed the spoon for a long time, sniffed it intently, as if she were afraid it was a trick. Then she started eating, quickly, greedily, choking. Ethan gently pushed the bowl away. He said quietly, slowly, It's not going anywhere. If you eat too fast, your stomach will hurt. Lily looked up at him. Different eyes. Still distrustful, but alive. She asked, "Will there be some tomorrow too?" Ethan said, "Tomorrow's will be better." Tobias ate in silence, slowly, carefully, without looking up. He didn't praise him or thank him, but he ate everything, down to the last drop. And when Ethan offered seconds, the boy hesitated and then nodded. Once. Briefly. To Ethan, that nod meant more than any words. After the meal, Ethan went out into the yard. He looked around. The house was in terrible shape. The roof was leaking in 3 places. The porch was wobbly. The fence had fallen over. But next to the house stood a shed. Half ruined, but it had tools. A rusty axe. A saw with half its teeth missing. A hammer. A handful of bent nails. A rope. Ethan picked up the axe. He tried to swing it. His hands shot with pain. Corvin's body wasn't used to physical labor. It was used to the jug. Never mind. It would get used to it. He started small. He gathered the rotten boards from the fence. He picked out the ones that were still holding up. He boarded up the hole in the shed wall. He repaired the porch. Every movement was a struggle. By noon, he was drenched in sweat and staggering from weakness. But 3 things had been done. The porch wasn't wobbly. The hole in the wall was patched. And next to the porch stood a barrel he'd found behind the shed and rolled under the gutter. The barrel was old, cracked. But if he caulked the cracks with moss, it would hold water. Ethan caulked it. The morning of the 4th day began with rain. Light, cold. Ethan went out to set his traps before dawn. The catch was more modest. 7 chub and 1 crayfish. Apparently, the fish at the rapids were starting to get used to the traps. He needed to move the traps further upstream. So he did. He found a new set of rapids 100 steps from the old one. It was a good spot. The bank had been eroded. The current was fast. The bottom was rocky. Fish were definitely swimming here. He set all 4 lines. He weighted them down. He returned home soaked to the skin. His body ached. A cold clung to Corvin's body like a burdock to a pair of pants. Ethan gritted his teeth. He couldn't afford to get sick. He walked into the house and saw Tobias sitting by the stove. The boy tossed a splinter into the fire. On his own. Without being asked. Without being told. He was keeping the fire going. Ethan didn't say anything. He just nodded. Tobias turned away. But he tossed in another splinter. For 5 days, Ethan worked nonstop. His body protested every second. His muscles, which were practically non-existent, screamed from the strain. His back wouldn't straighten. His fingers were rubbed raw from weaving thatch and hauling logs. But he didn't stop. Over those 5 days, he did the following. He repaired the roof. He patched all 3 holes. He gathered sod from the meadow beyond the village and laid it over the shingles. Not perfect, but the rain no longer dripped onto the sleeping children's heads. He fixed the stove. He rearranged the top stones. He cleared the chimney with a stick wrapped in a rag. The draft became steady. The smoke rose straight up instead of spreading throughout the house. He set up new fishing lines. Not 4 anymore, 6. 2 of them were large ones for big fish. He rearranged them every 2 days so the pools wouldn't run dry. The catch remained steady, 10 to 12 fish a day. The smokehouse was running constantly. The shelf in the pantry was filling up. Smoked fish lay in neat rows, wrapped in burdock leaves. On the 8th day, Ethan went beyond the outskirts into the forest. He needed meat. Fish is good, but children need animal fat, protein, calories. Lily was too thin. Her ribs showed through her skin. Tobias was a little sturdier but still weak. Ethan walked through the woods, reading them like a book. Here was a roe deer's track. Fresh, small hooves, a female. She was heading to the stream to drink. Here's some droppings. From yesterday, so she comes here regularly. Here's a gnawed-on bush. The lower branches have been eaten down to knee height. So, a hare. Lots of hares. They feed here in the evening. Ethan was looking for a spot to set a trap. He found an animal trail, a narrow one, between 2 boulders. An animal passed through here regularly. The grass is trampled. The branches are broken at thigh height. A roe deer. He began setting up a snare, a simple design, 2 stakes driven into the ground. Between them, a horizontal crossbar with a rope loop. The rope is tied to a bent twig. The animal steps on the trigger. The twig straightens. The loop tightens around its leg. That's it. For this world, such a trap was a revelation. Local hunters used to chase game with dogs or sit with spears at the watering hole for half the day. The trap worked while you slept. Ethan set 3 snares along the trail. Then he set 4 loops for hares in the undergrowth. The loops were made of thin twine that he had twisted himself from nettle fibers. Nettles grew behind the shed. There were plenty of them. He pulled it up with his bare hands, and his hands burned like fire. But the twine turned out to be strong. On the way back, he picked some wild garlic and sorrel. He gathered plantain and yarrow. Yarrow is an antiseptic. Plantain is for inflammation. Willow bark is for pain and fever. He dried the herbs on a rope above the stove. Tobias looked at the bundles of herbs and said nothing. Lily touched a bunch of yarrow and sneezed. Ethan smiled. She didn't flinch. On the 10th day, the snare worked. Ethan came to the trail and saw a roe deer, a young female. The snare had caught her by the hind leg. She was alive and struggling. Ethan took out his knife, that same dull, rusty knife. He'd sharpened it for 2 evenings in a row on a stone by the stream. Now the blade was passable. He killed the roe deer quickly, with a single cut to the throat. Not because he was cruel, because he didn't want her to suffer. Then he began to butcher it right there on the spot. He let the blood drain out. He skinned it, carefully, in one piece. The hide is leather. Leather is shoes. Shoes were something his children didn't have. Tobias walked barefoot. Lily wore some rags wrapped around her feet. Ethan butchered the carcass so that nothing would go to waste. The meat separately. The bones for broth. The tendons for twine. The fat for candles and cooking. He rinsed the entrails in the stream. He set aside the liver for the children. The liver is rich in iron. Lily was as pale as a sheet. She needs iron. He hauled the meat home in 2 trips. It was heavy. Corvin's body couldn't take it. Halfway there, he sat down on a stump and rested for 10 minutes. His breathing was ragged. His heart was pounding. His muscles were trembling. But he got up and kept going. He hung the roe deer carcass in the smokehouse. He sliced it into thin strips. He rubbed it with salt and that wild garlic. Alder smoke enveloped the meat. In 2 days, he'd have dried venison, or rather, roe deer. But the point is the same. He divided up the other half. He kept some for himself. He cooked a thick soup with the bones and wild onions. Tobias ate, and this time he looked up. He looked at Ethan. For a long time, he didn't say anything, but there was something new in that gaze. Not distrust, recognition, acknowledgement of a fact. This man is doing what he promised. Ethan wrapped the other half of the meat in burdock leaves and carried it 3 yards away. Anika Dramer lived there, a widow, 3 children. Pierce, 9 years old, Nor, 7, little Ilam, who had just turned 2. Anika's husband had been killed while hunting 6 months ago. A bear had mauled him. Ethan knew this from Corvin's memory. He knew something else, too. The village hunters had refused to go with her husband. He owed them. They decided that a debt was more important than life. And the man went after the bear alone. Ethan knocked on the door. Anika opened it. Thin, wiry. Her hands were red from lye. Her eyes were sunken. She saw him, and her face turned to stone. Corvin was not welcome here. Corvin was despised here, just as he was everywhere else. Ethan silently held out the bundle. Anika didn't take it. She looked at him suspiciously. He said it was meat, a roe deer, for the children. He said he wanted nothing in return. Anika remained silent. Behind her stood Pierce, a 9-year-old boy wearing his father's boots, which were 4 sizes too big for him. The boy's feet were rubbed raw and bleeding. Ethan saw him shifting from foot to foot. He set the bundle on the porch and walked away without looking back. An hour later, he peeked out the window. The bundle was gone from the porch. On the 12th day, Ethan went to the blacksmith. The blacksmith's name was Harold. He was big, broad-shouldered. His hands were like shovels. He was the only one in the village whose yard was in order. The fence was sturdy. The smithy was smoky. The blacksmith always had work: horseshoes, nails, staples, knives. Ethan didn't come empty-handed. He brought 3 smoked fish. He set them down by the blacksmith's doorstep. Harold came out. He looked at the fish. He looked at Ethan. The blacksmith's face didn't look promising. He remembered Corvin. He remembered how Corvin used to come begging and making promises, and never came back. Ethan said he needed his axe repaired. He said he'd pay with work. Any kind. Whatever the blacksmith. Harold was silent. Then he said one word. No. And he slammed the door shut. Ethan stood in front of the closed door. The fish remained lying on the threshold. He turned around and walked home. Deep down, he felt no resentment, only understanding. Corvin had left such a deep mess that one fish wouldn't be enough to clean it up. Never mind. He'd wait. On the 14th day, Martha came to see him, an elderly neighbor. The very same one who had clicked her tongue when he was setting traps. She didn't come into the house. She stood by the fence. Ethan came out. Martha looked at him silently. Then she said her joints ached. She said that every winter she was bedridden for 2 weeks straight and thought she'd be better off dead. She said she'd heard he was drying some kind of herbs. You never know. Ethan nodded. He went back inside. He returned with a bundle of willow bark. He explained to Martha how to brew it. A handful of bark per mug of boiling water. Let it steep until it cools. Drink it in the morning and evening. It won't take the pain away completely, but it'll make it easier to bear. Martha took the bark. She twirled it between her fingers. She looked at Ethan as if he were some kind of oddity. She asked how he knew such things. Ethan said his mother had taught him. Martha snorted. She left. 3 days later, she came back. She brought a pot of porridge. She set it on the porch. She said her joints hurt less. She said it was millet porridge and that the children should eat it. Then she left without looking back. The third week. Ethan woke up because someone was tugging at his sleeve. It was Lily. She was standing next to the bench where he'd been sleeping, pulling on his shirt. Her eyes were wide and serious. She said that Tobias had left. Ethan sat up. His heart skipped a beat. He asked where he'd gone. Lily didn't know. She said she'd woken up and he wasn't there. Ethan slipped on his boots. He went out into the yard. Dawn. Fog in the lowlands. Silence. He walked around the house, the barn, the smokehouse. Tobias was nowhere to be found. Ethan went to the creek and found him. The boy was standing knee-deep in the water by the sleet, barefoot, wearing only a shirt. He was trying to pull up the dip net. It was heavy, with a fish in it. He was pulling with both hands but couldn't manage it. Ethan stopped. He didn't approach right away. He stood and watched. Tobias was pulling on the dip net and losing the struggle. The current was dragging him back. His feet were slipping on the rocks. But the boy didn't give up. He braced himself and kept pulling. His teeth were clenched. His face was red with the strain. Ethan walked over. He didn't say a word. He simply stood beside him and took hold of the fishing line. Together they pulled it ashore. 6 chub were thrashing inside. Tobias stood there wet and shivering. He looked at the fish. Then he looked up at Ethan. He waited. For a shout. For punishment. For what had always happened before when he did something without permission. Ethan took off his shirt and draped it over the boy's shoulders. He said that next time he should wake him up. It's faster together. Tobias blinked. Just once. And he nodded. The two of them carried the fish home together. Tobias carried the 2 smallest chub, pressing them to his chest. He carried them so earnestly, as if they weren't fish but gold bars. That day became a turning point. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because, for the first time, Tobias did something for his family of his own free will. He hadn't forgiven him. He didn't trust him yet, but he'd decided to give it a try. And for Ethan, that meant more than any words could say. After breakfast, Ethan set about doing what he'd been thinking about for several days. Shoes. Tobias walked barefoot, and his feet were covered in scrapes and blisters. Lily wore rags on her feet. Fall was coming soon. Then winter. Going barefoot in winter means frostbite. Frostbite means gangrene. Gangrene means death. In a world where the nearest healer costs a month's income and the nearest priest of the Order of the Bright Circle charges a tithe for a simple blessing. The roe deer hide lay in the barn. Ethan had stretched it over a wicker frame 3 days ago. He scraped off the fat. He rubbed it with ash. The hide was almost ready. Not a perfect tan, rough, but soft and durable. He spread the hide out on the table. He placed Tobias's foot on the hide, traced around it with a charcoal stick, then Lily's foot. He began to cut. With a knife. Slowly. Carefully. He sewed it with sinew thread from those very roe deer tendons that he'd dried and split. He made the awl out of bone. The work took 2 days. His hands ached. His fingers were pricked until they bled. But by evening on the second day, there were 2 pairs of shoes on the table. Small. A little crooked. But they fit her feet. With double-layered leather soles. With twine laces. Lily put on hers and walked around the house. She stopped, looked at her feet, then at Ethan, and she smiled. Not the kind of smile you give out of politeness. The kind you give when a miracle happens. Tobias put on his in silence. He walked around in them, took them off, placed them neatly by the bench, as if they were a treasure, as if they were something that mustn't be ruined. The next day, Ethan went to Annika's house. Not with meat this time, with a measuring tape, a piece of string on which he'd tied knots to mark the measurements. He knocked. Annika opened the door. Her face was just as stony as ever, but she didn't slam the door shut. Ethan said he wanted to measure Pierce's foot, for shoes. Annika narrowed her eyes. She asked why. Ethan said he'd seen the boy walking in his father's boots. He said the boy's feet were rubbed raw and bleeding, and if this continued, he'd lose his toes by winter. Annika was silent for a long time. Then she called for Pierce. The boy came out, thin, with his mother's eyes, wary. Ethan crouched down in front of him. He measured his foot. The left was slightly larger than the right. The toes on his right foot were red and swollen. The blisters were bleeding. Ethan clenched his teeth. But he said nothing. He marked the measurements with knots on a piece of string. He thanked Annika. Then he left. 3 days later, he brought the boots. Not just shoes, boots, made to measure. With a soft lining of rabbit fur. He'd caught the rabbit in a snare 2 days earlier. He carefully removed the fur and sewed it inside the boots. Pierce put them on. He walked around. He stopped. He looked at his mother. Annika turned away quickly and went around the corner of the house. Ethan could hear her breathing there, ragged and rapid. He didn't follow her. He just stood there and waited. When Annika returned, her eyes were red. She said one word. Thank you. From that day on, Annika began to greet him. Briefly, with a nod. But she started, and Pierce began coming to his yard. He would stand silently by the fence and watch Ethan work. Once, Ethan showed him how to weave a basket. The boy sat down next to him and gave it a try. His fingers were nimble, quick. He caught on right away. An hour later, he'd made his first basket. Crooked, loose, but functional. Pierce looked at his creation, and an expression appeared on his face that Ethan had never seen before. Pride. The quiet pride of a young boy who, for the first time in his life, had made something useful with his own hands. By the end of the 3rd week, rumors were spreading through the village. Ethan knew this because Martha had told him. The old woman came every 3 days for willow bark. Her joints ached less and less, and she was becoming more talkative. She said that the village didn't understand what was going on. Corvin had been a drunk and a troublemaker. And now here was a man who caught fish, smoked meat, made shoes for the children, and treated the old woman's knees. Some said he'd gone mad. Others said he'd found treasure in the woods and was now showing off. Still others said it was temporary, and that in a week he'd be back in the today. Marta told him this straight out. She said she didn't believe he'd changed either, but her joints hurt less, and his children had started to look like living people rather than corpses. And so she would wait a while before jumping to conclusions. Ethan nodded. He thanked her for her honesty. Martha snorted and left. On the 20th day, something happened that nearly ruined everything. Ethan came home from the forest that evening. He'd been checking the traps. There was a hare in one snare. The cage trap was empty. He was carrying the hare in his hand and thinking about how he needed to set 2 more cage traps on the northern trail. There were wild boar tracks there. A big one. A wild boar means 50 pounds of meat if he's lucky. He walked into the house and saw Tobias. The boy was standing by the table. There was a bowl on the table, smashed. in two pieces. Tobias was standing over the bowl, his face white as chalk. He didn't move. He wasn't breathing. He stood there waiting for the blow. Every fiber of his being was waiting for the blow, because Corvin hit him for a broken bowl. Always. Ethan stopped in the doorway. He looked at the bowl. He looked at Tobias. The boy didn't look up. His shoulders were hunched up to his ears. His hands were pressed against his sides, the posture of a person bracing for pain. A 6-year-old child stood in the posture of someone ready to be beaten. Ethan set the hair down on the bench. He walked over to the table. He picked up the two halves of the bowl. He looked at them. Then he said calmly and quietly that it was just a bowl. He said he would carve a new one. He said it would be made of linden wood. Linden is a good wood for tableware. It's soft. It doesn't crack. Tobias stood motionless. Ethan crouched down in front of him, without touching him, at arm's length. He said he would never hit him. Not over a bowl, not over anything else. Never. Tobias looked up. His eyes were filled with tears. But he didn't cry. He held them back. Like a grown-up. Like a little old man who was used to holding back. Ethan got up and went out into the yard. He sat on the porch. He sat there for a long time. He watched the sunset. He thought about how Corvin deserved his death. He thought about how there are things that can't be fixed with words. Only with time. Only with each day in which there are no screams and no blows. Only that. On the 22nd day, Ethan began to build. Not to repair, to build. Behind the house stood a half-ruined barn. Corvin had once kept a goat there. The goat had died. The barn had fallen apart. Ethan tore down what was left. He cleared the site. And he began to erect a new structure. Not a barn. A workshop. A small one. 4 posts. A shingle roof. Walls of wattle and daub. Inside, a workbench made of logs. Shelves for tools. A place to work. He worked from dawn till dusk. His body was getting used to it. Slowly. Painfully. But it was getting used to it. His hands weren't shaking anymore. His legs were holding up. His back still ached, but not as sharply. 2 weeks of non-stop work in the fresh air and decent food were taking their toll. Corvin's body was beginning to come back to life. Pierce came by every day. He helped carry clay from the stream. He kneaded it with his feet. He handed him the twigs for the wattle. He worked silently and diligently. One day, Annika came by. She stood by the fence. She watched as Ethan and her son smeared clay on the wall. Elam was sleeping in her arms. Nor stood nearby. Annika didn't say a word. She stood there for about 10 minutes. Then she left. But the next day she came back, and the third day. On the 4th day, she stepped over the fence and began kneading the clay, without a word, without asking. Ethan nodded at her. She nodded back. They worked in silence. Shoulder to shoulder, each lost in their own thoughts. But their hands were working together. The 5th week. Ethan stood at the edge of the forest and looked at the tracks. A wild boar, a big one, 100 pounds. Maybe more. The tracks were deep. The hooves were wide. The beast passed through here every evening. It walked from its lair in the spruce grove to the watering hole at the distant stream. The trail was trampled down to the ground. The boar had been coming here for a long time. It felt like the master of the place. Ethan crouched down and thought. A standard boar snare wouldn't hold it. A snare around its leg won't work. The beast is too strong. It'll tear the rope. So I need a pit trap. A classic one. Deep, covered with twigs and leaves, with sharpened stakes at the bottom. Rough, brutal. But if you don't have a gun or a steel trap, there's no third option. Ethan chose a spot on the trail, between 2 trees, where the path narrowed. A wild boar wouldn't veer off here. He started digging. He didn't have a shovel, just a sharpened stake in his hands. He dug all day. The soil was heavy and clayey. Tree roots got in the way. By evening, the pit was waist deep. Not deep enough. It needed to be chest deep. He returned the next day, and the day after that. He dug for 3 days. His hands were covered in blisters and cuts. His back had turned into one solid knot of pain. But the pit was ready. Deep. Wide. At the bottom, 4 sharpened stakes. On top, Ethan laid thin twigs. He covered them with leaves, sprinkled earth over them. He camouflaged it so well that from 3 paces away, you couldn't tell it was different from the trail. He went home and fell into a deep, dead sleep. On the 6th day, the trap worked. Evan came to the trail and heard it from a distance. A heavy wheezing, a commotion. The boar lay at the bottom of the pit, alive. One stake had pierced its side, the second its hind leg. The beast was wounded and furious. Ethan stood at the edge and watched. Getting the boar out of the pit was a job for 2 people, at least. But there was no one around. He thought for a moment. Then he went and chopped down a long pole. He returned. He thrust the pole into the pit. The boar grunted and tried to stand up. Ethan struck it on the skull with the pole. Hard. Once, twice, 3 times. The boar went still. Ethan climbed down into the pit. He slit its throat. Hot, dark blood gushed out. He stood ankle-deep in blood and mud, thinking that in a past life, a single shot would have been enough for this. But there was no past life was gone. This one remained, with a stake and a knife. It took 2 hours to pull the boar out of the pit. He tied a rope around the carcass, threw it over a tree branch, pulled. Corvin's body creaked under the strain. The rope cut into his palms. But the boar was out. Ethan sat down next to the carcass and caught his breath for about 5 minutes. Then he began to butcher it, as always, completely, without waste. The meat separately, fat separately, bones separately, hide separately. A boar's hide is thick and coarse. You can make a shield, a sheath, or a sword out of it. The bristles for rope. Rinse the intestines and use them as casings for sausages. Ethan was butchering the carcass and estimating the yield. 100 pounds of meat. If smoked and cured properly, that's enough to last 3 or 4 weeks for 3 people. Or 2 if shared. And he was planning to share it. He carried the meat in 4 trips. Each one was harder than the last. On the 3rd trip, Pierce saw him. The boy was standing by the road, watching. His eyes grew as big as saucers. A wild boar. A whole wild boar. For a village where meat was a rare sight, maybe once a month, this was a big deal. Pierce ran after him. He helped haul the last load. Together they dragged the meat into the yard. Ethan hung the pieces on ropes in the smokehouse. He rubbed the rest with salt and garlic and put it away in the pantry. The pantry no longer looked shabby. The shelves were full. Smoked fish, dried venison, now wild boar, bundles of herbs, a pot of lard, a small bag of salt that he'd traded to a passing cart driver for 10 smoked fish. Ethan stood in front of these shelves and counted. If nothing happened, there would be enough food for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of peace. 3 weeks during which he could think not about where to get dinner, but about what to do next. He divided half of the wild boar into 4 parts. He took one to Annika. She took it without a word. She no longer asked why. The second went to Marta. The old woman pursed her lips and said she hadn't asked for it. Ethan said she didn't need to ask. Marta took the meat and grumbled that there would be porridge tomorrow. He took the 3rd part to the widow Greta Falcon, who lived at the far end of the village with her 2 teenage daughters. Greta hadn't left the house in weeks. The neighbors said she'd given up. Ethan knocked. It took a long time for the door to open. Then the door opened a crack. A gaunt, gray face. Empty eyes. Ethan set the meat on the threshold and said it was for the girls. Greta looked at the meat. She looked at him. She didn't say a word, but she took it. He left a quarter of it, for something else. The next day he went to the blacksmith's. Not with fish, with a piece of wild boar shoulder. 3 pounds of fresh meat. He set it down by the blacksmith's threshold. He stood there. Harper came out. He looked at the meat. He looked at Ethan. The blacksmith's face was strange. Not angry, not contemptuous, just different. He was silent for a long time. Then he asked how Ethan had taken down the boar. Ethan explained. A hunting pit, stakes at the bottom, twigs on top. Harold listened. Then he said that in 20 years in Holmwood, not a single hunter had taken a wild boar alone. Ethan shrugged. He said he hadn't done it alone. The trap had done the work for him. Harold was silent for a moment longer. Then he told Ethan to bring his axe tomorrow morning. Ethan nodded, turned around, left. Didn't say thank you, didn't say much at all, just left. Behind him, he heard Harold pick up the meat from the threshold. The smithy door closed. The next day, Ethan brought the axe. Harold took it. He turned it over in his hands. His face twisted. The axe was in terrible condition. The blade was chipped. The handle was loose. The handle was cracked. Harold said it would be easier to just throw it away. Ethan said there wasn't another one. Harold grunted. He set the axe on the anvil, and he began to work. Ethan stood nearby and watched. The blacksmith's hands were precise and steady. He reforged the blade. He set it back in place. He adjusted the wedge. He sharpened the edge. 2 hours later, the axe was ready. Sharp. Heavy. It fit the handle like a glove. Ethan took it, tested the balance, and said one thing. He said the center of gravity was shifted toward the blade, and if it were moved back a finger's width, it would be easier to chop. The blow would come not only from the steel but also from the mass. Harold stared at him. For a long time. Then he said that Corvin had never heard such words in his life. Ethan replied that people change. Harold didn't believe him. It was obvious. But he took the axe back, removed the blade, reattached it. A finger's width back, just as Ethan had said. He tried it himself. He swung at a log. The log split as if struck by lightning. Harold looked at the axe, then at Ethan. He said one word. Where from? Ethan repeated it. People change. Harold didn't smile, but something resembling interest flashed in his eyes. Not friendliness, not distrust. The professional interest of a master who had seen something unusual. As Ethan was leaving the smithy, he bumped into a girl. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-tanned forearms and a short cropped braid. Mayrin, Harold's daughter. She worked in the blacksmith shop alongside her father because Harold had no sons. Mayrin blocked his path. She looked down at him. She was half a head taller, and twice as broad across the shoulders. She said she'd overheard his conversation with his father about the center of gravity. She said she wanted to see that strange axe he'd made himself. Ethan hadn't made any axe, but a memory flashed through Corvin's mind. An old axe with a resharpened blade. Corvin had found it on the road and sharpened it on a stone. It was crooked, but the angle of the edge was different. Wedge-shaped. Not like the locals' axes. Apparently, one of this body's previous owners knew something. Or maybe Corvin had accidentally copied what he'd seen someone else do. Ethan said he'd show her. Mayrin nodded. Sharply. Businesslike. She said that if he was lying, she wouldn't believe him. If he wasn't lying, then let him explain. Then she turned and walked into the smithy. Ethan watched her go. He hadn't expected that. In a village where everyone looked at him with contempt or suspicion, the blacksmith's daughter had come with a question. Not a complaint. Not with a request. With a technical question. This was something new. The second month. Ethan sat in the workshop and drew, with charcoal on a flat board. A sketch. A diagram. Not for himself, for Myrene. A saw. A standard two-handed saw with widely spaced teeth. The local saws were straight. The teeth were all in a single line. Sawing with them was torture. The wood would clamp down on the blade. The saw would get stuck. A man would spend half a day on a single log. Ethan knew why. The tooth spacing. Every other tooth was bent to the side. Alternating. Left, right, left, right. The cut ends up wider than the blade. Nothing gets jammed. The speed is 3 times faster. He drew the diagram and rushed it to Myrene. Myrene was standing by the forge. She was pumping the bellows. Sweat was streaming down her forehead. Her forearms glistened from the heat. She saw Ethan and wiped her hands on her apron. He placed the board with the drawing on the anvil. Myrene looked at it. She leaned in. She ran her finger along the lines. She was silent for a long time. Then she asked why the teeth were crooked. Ethan explained. About the pitch, about the kerf width, about friction. Myrene listened. Her face was focused. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She took it all in. Then she said she'd give it a try. But if it didn't work out, that would be his problem. Ethan nodded. Myron took the old saw, clamped it in the vise, began bending the teeth back, with pliers, one by one, left, right, left. She worked for an hour. Ethan stood nearby and said nothing. He didn't offer any advice. He didn't interfere. She knew metal better than he did. All she needed was the idea. She did the rest herself. When the last tooth was bent back, Myron removed the saw from the vise. She went out into the yard. She walked over to the log lying against the wall. She set the saw down. She pulled. The saw started moving. Easily. Smoothly. The teeth cut into the wood without getting stuck. Sawdust fell in a wide strip. Myron sawed, and the expression on her face slowly changed, from disbelief to surprise, and from surprise to something that remonstrated delight, though it was restrained and controlled. She finished sawing through the log. She looked at the cut. Smooth, clean. Then she looked at Ethan, and said he was either a genius or a sorcerer. Ethan replied that he was neither. He'd just seen how it was done in other places. Myron narrowed her eyes. What kind of places? Ethan said they were far from here. Myron didn't believe him. But she didn't press the issue. She took the blueprint and told him to come by tomorrow. She had questions. Lots of questions. From that day on, what Ethan privately called his evening lectures began. Every day after work, he would come to the smithy. Myron would finish up her work, and they would sit down in the courtyard. Ethan would draw. He explained. He demonstrated. Not just about the saw, about tempering steel, about the angle of a knife's edge, about the difference between soft and hard iron, about how to make the simplest bearing out of a wooden sleeve and grease. Myron listened with the kind of expression people usually reserve for heretics, a mixture of horror and eager curiosity. She asked questions. A lot. Harshly. She didn't take anything at face value. She demanded to see, to prove it, to explain why. Ethan explained. And every time the explanation was confirmed in practice, Myron fell silent. For a long time. Then she would say the same thing. How do you know that? Ethan would say the same thing. My mother taught me. Myron snorted. She didn't believe in his mother, but she believed in the result. The saw worked. A knife sharpened using his method lasted 3 times as long. The bearing spun. That was enough. Harold watched. Silently. From the blacksmith shop. He didn't come out to them. He didn't interfere. But one day Ethan noticed that the blacksmith was standing by the door, listening. Listening as Ethan explained the principle of the lever to his daughter. Harold listened for about 10 minutes. Then he went back to the anvil. The next day he came out and sat down beside them. He didn't say a word. He just sat there and listened. Ethan kept explaining. It was as if nothing had changed. But inside, something warmed within him. The blacksmith sat down beside him. That meant more than a repaired axe. More than a piece of meat he'd accepted. The blacksmith acknowledged that this former drunk knew something worthwhile. Not with words, with his presence. In the middle of the 2nd month, Ethan did something that changed the dynamics of the village. A plow. Not a whole new plow, he didn't have that much iron. But he refurbished an old one. In village elder Gerald's barn stood a plow that had been used to plow the fields back in his father's day. Wooden. With an iron tip. Straight. Like a stick stuck in the ground. It poked at the soil rather than turning it over. Plowing with it was like digging with a spoon. Ethan asked Gerald for permission to take a look. The village headman was an old and weary man. His beard was gray. His eyes were watery. He was afraid of everything. The Baron's scribes. Wolves. Winter. His own shadow. But he feared Ethan less than he used to. The village whispered that Corbin had changed. Gerald didn't believe it, but he didn't argue either. He allowed Ethan to take a look. Ethan examined the plow. Then he went to see Myron. He drew what he needed on the board. A mold board. A curved iron plate attached to the plowshare. When the plow moves across the ground, the mold board doesn't just cut through the soil. It turns the layer over, bringing the bottom layer to the top and the top layer to the bottom. This aerates the soil. It destroys weeds. It doubles the harvest with the same amount of work. Myron looked at the sketch, then at Ethan, then back at the drawing. She said she could make it, but she needed iron. A lot of it, more than she had. Ethan said he'd find some. He found it. Not iron, but the raw material from which it could be made. In the ruins of an abandoned yard on the edge of the village, he found the wreckage of an old wagon. Iron wheel rims, staples, nails. Rusty, but iron nonetheless. He gathered everything he found, dragged it to the forge. Mayron sorted it out, heated the bellows, and began to forge. 3 days. Ethan came by and watched. He didn't get in the way. Myron worked. The hammer struck rhythmically and heavily. Sparks flew. On the 3rd day, the plowshare was ready. Rough, heavy, but with the right curve. Ethan attached it to the plow, took it out to the field, harnessed the only horse in the village to the plow, the village headman Gerald's old nag, and plowed the first furrow. The soil turned over, the topsoil evenly. The dark subsoil was now on top, rich and moist. Ethan plowed a 2nd furrow, then a 3rd. The plow moved more heavily than usual. The horse resisted, but the soil was being turned over. Gerald stood at the edge of the field. He stood and watched. His mouth was slightly agape. 4 other men stood nearby. One of them crouched down. He touched the turned-over layer of soil. He crumpled it between his fingers. He looked at Ethan, at the plow, at the soil, and said he hadn't seen plowing like that in 40 years. Toward evening, Gerald came to see Ethan, alone, for the first time. Before, the village elder had avoided him like the plague. Gerald sat down on the porch. He was silent for a long time. Then he asked if Ethan could make the same kind of plow for the village. Ethan said he could, but he needed iron, and he needed the village to grant him the right to the hunting grounds north of the stream, the ones that had lain fallow for 3 years because no one had gone there after a pack of ghouls was spotted in those parts. Gerald grimaced. The hunting grounds were communal property. Granting them to a single person is against custom. Ethan said he wasn't asking for ownership. He was asking for the right to use them, on the condition that 1/10 of the catch goes into the village's common pot. Gerald thought about it, for a long time. Then he said he'd talk to the men. He stood up. He left. At the next village meeting, the issue was raised. Ethan wasn't present. Corvin wasn't allowed into the meeting, an old rule. But Martha told them what happened. They argued for 2 hours. Half were against it. The other half were for it. Harold's vote decided it. The blacksmith said one thing. He said that Corvin was a drunkard and a scoundrel. But over the past month, he had done more for the village than all of them put together. The plow works. That's a fact. Let him take the land. They voted. A 3-vote margin. Ethan received the land. That changed everything. The land north of the stream covers 10 square of forest, spruce groves, oak groves, 2 streams, a lake. There was enough game there to feed 3 villages. Ethan started setting traps in earnest. Not just 2 or 3, 20, 30. A network of different types of traps. Snares for hares, spring traps for roe deer, pit traps along wild boar trails, fish traps on the lake, bird snares. Every day he checked the line. Every day he brought back game. Tobias went with him. The boy said nothing but walked alongside him. He was learning. He watched as Ethan read the tracks, as he checked the traps, as he butchered the carcass. He soaked it all in. Once, he spotted a hare's track on his own. Fresh. He pointed it out. Ethan nodded. He set a snare. The next morning, there was a hare in the snare. Tobias stood over the hare, and his face bore an expression Ethan had seen before on Pierce's face. Pride. Quiet, small, but genuine. By the middle of the 2nd month, Annika had crossed a line. Not a physical one, an emotional one. She came to Ethan that evening. Her children were asleep. She was holding Ilam in her arms. She said she wanted to talk. Ethan brought her a stool. They sat down by the smokehouse. Smoke rose up into the evening sky. Annika was silent for about 5 minutes. Then she said her house was falling apart. The roof was leaking. The walls were rotting. The stove was smoking. She couldn't handle it alone. She had no one to help her. No relatives. The neighbors didn't care. She said this matter-of-factly, without self-pity, as a fact. Ethan listened. Then he asked why she was telling him this. Annika looked at him, with a long, steady gaze. Because in the past 2 months, he was the only one who had helped her. The only one. No strings attached. No questions asked. Without expecting anything in return. She said she wasn't asking for charity. She was offering to work. She would work in his yard. Cook, sew, spin, do laundry, whatever he says. In return, he'll fix up her house. Or, she said this slowly and with difficulty, like someone uttering something they'd been thinking about for weeks. Or she'll move in, with the children, into the second house on his property. That empty house standing right next door. The former home of Corvin's neighbor, who left to join the Baron 2 years ago. The house is empty. It's falling apart. But if it's repaired, it's livable. Annika's move took 2 days. She didn't have many belongings. A bundle of clothes, 2 pots, a spinning wheel, a blanket, a cradle for Elam. That was all. Ethan carried it all in 4 trips. Pierce hauled the spinning wheel. Tobias carried a pot on his head and looked so serious that Lily burst out laughing. Tobias shot her a sideways glance but said nothing. He didn't smile. But he didn't snap back. For Tobias, that was progress. The second house was in terrible shape, but Ethan had worked on it for a week before the move. He re-roofed it, caulked the walls, rebuilt the stove. The floor was still dirt, but Ethan covered it with spruce branches and threw a boar hide on top. Not a palace, but it was dry, warm, and it didn't smell like mold. Annika went inside. She walked around the room. She touched the wall. She ran her finger along the stove. She turned to Ethan and nodded. With that single nod, she said everything there was to say. From the very first day, Annika got to work so hard that Ethan could only blink in amazement. She was up before dawn. She stoked the stoves in both houses. She put porridge on to cook. She kneaded dough. By the time Ethan woke up, there was a hot pot on the table and a flatbread. It was lopsided, made from coarse flour she'd traded with Martha for a bundle of wool. But it was hot and real. Lily ate the flatbread with an expression on her face as if it were a festive cake. Ethan chewed and realized one simple thing. He's a hunter, a builder, a craftsman. But he doesn't know how to run a household. Not in this world. Annika does. She knows when to sow peas, what kind of clay is suitable for pots, how to spin thread so it doesn't, how to wash clothes in cold water so they don't fall apart. Dozens of things he didn't know and that can't be learned from books. She wasn't just a worker. She was the other half of the household, the part he was missing. Annika got their household up and running in a week. She divided the chores among the children. Pierce hauled water and chopped small firewood. Nora swept the floors and fed the chickens. There were 3 chickens. Ethan traded for them with a farmer from a neighboring farmstead in exchange for 10 smoked fish. They were skinny, vicious birds that pecked at anything that moved. But they laid eggs, 1 or 2 a day. To the children, these were like gold. Every morning, Tobias went with Ethan to the stream. It became their ritual, a silent morning ritual. They walked to the stream, pulled out the fishing nets, counted the fish, and carried them home. Tobias didn't speak, but he walked alongside Ethan every morning, without fail. Lily and little Elam stayed with Annika. Lily no longer hid behind Tobias's back when Ethan came into the house. She would run up to him, grab his pant leg, tell him she'd seen a beetle, or that a chicken had laid an egg, or that Nora had shown her how to braid her hair. Ethan listened. He nodded. He replied. Every time Lily ran up to him, he felt a twinge. Sharp, bitter. She reminded him of Maddie, his daughter, the one he'd left behind in another world, the one with no one to pick her up from school. He didn't think about it during the day. He didn't allow himself to. But at night, he would sometimes lie there, staring at the ceiling, thinking about a 12-year-old girl waiting for a father who would never come. On the 3rd day after Annika moved in, something happened that caught Ethan off guard. He'd returned from a hunt. 2 roe deer in the snares in a single morning. Lucky break. He was hauling the meat into the yard when he saw Annika. She was standing by the smokehouse looking at him. A strange man was standing next to her. Short, stooped, with an eye patch over his left eye. His left arm hung limply by his side. Bony, lifeless. The man was staring at the ground. Annika said this was Ren Callie, a former hunter. He'd lost his arm and eye 2 years ago. A bear. The very same one that had killed her husband. Ren had survived but was left crippled. He lived in a dugout behind the village. He begged for scraps. His wife had left for her family's home, taking the children with her. No one wanted him. Annika said she'd brought him there. Ethan looked at Ren. The man stood as if he were expecting a kick. He was used to it. Ethan asked what he could do with one hand. Ren raised his head. A spark flashed in his one eye, a malicious, bitter spark. He said he could set snares, knit nets, weave rope, gut fish, butchering game. Anything that could be done with one hand and a knife. Ethan nodded. He said dinner would be ready in an hour. He told him to sit down. Ren sat down at the table and ate in silence. Hungrily, like a man who hadn't had a hot meal in a week. The children watched him with curiosity. Lily asked why Uncle didn't have an arm. Ethan said that Uncle was a brave hunter. Ren raised his head and looked at Ethan. For a long time. Something had changed in his eyes. Not gratitude. Surprise. He'd been called brave. For the first time in 2 years. With Ren, the farm now numbered 8 people. 5 adults, if you counted Pierce, who worked alongside the adults, and 4 children. Ren turned out to be more valuable than Ethan had expected. With one hand, he could weave faster than Ethan could with 2. Snares, nets, baskets, traps. His fingers were like iron. 30 years in the woods hadn't been wasted. He knew every trail in the area, every ravine, every watering hole. Ethan set traps by the book. Ren knew exactly where to set them. Together, they were the perfect team. In their first week working together, their catch doubled. But Ren brought more than just his hands. He brought information. That evening by the campfire, after the children had fallen asleep, Ren told Ethan what he knew about Baron Kaltwasser, about his men, about Havelock Marsh. He explained that Havelock wasn't just a clerk. He's the Baron's eyes and ears. He keeps track of every farmstead in every village within 20 miles. He knows who earns what, who owes whom, whose land is on the verge of being repossessed. He shows up with a smile and offers help, a grain loan, protection from bandits, a place on the Baron's estates. People take the loan because they're hungry. 6 months later, Havelock returns, with interest. There's nothing to pay with. Havelock pulls out a piece of paper. Sign here. The land passes to the Baron. The person becomes a serf. It's all done politely. It's all done by the book. It's all done with a smile. Over the past 3 years, the Baron has taken 14 farms in the district this way. 14 families have lost their land. Ren said that Holmwood is next. Ethan listened and said nothing. Then he asked when Havelock would come again. Ren said in a month. Maybe sooner. He always arrives before fall, when people start thinking about winter, when fear is stronger than pride. Ethan lay awake that night thinking. He had less than a month. Less than a month before the polite man with damp fingers would arrive and start offering help. And the village would accept it. Because the village was hungry and frightened. Because winter is near. Because it's easier to take out a loan now than to starve to death in January. Ethan had to give the village a reason to refuse. A reason that would carry more weight than fear. In the morning he gathered everyone. Annika, Rena, Pierce, even Tobias. He sat on the porch and said this. There are 2.5 months until winter. During that time, they need to stock up on enough food to feed not just themselves, but the whole village, or at least those who agree to work together. He said he knew how. The hunting grounds were vast. There was plenty of game. But they needed more hands, more traps, more smokehouses. They needed a system, not just one makeshift smokehouse out of a barrel, 3, 5, proper ones, with proper draft, with shelves for the meat, with troughs for the fat. We need a tannery. The hides he's currently drying on sticks can be tanned and sold. We need a vegetable garden, not just 3 raised beds, but a real one, with crop rotation, with compost, with water from the stream. Annika listened. Ren listened. Pierce listened with his mouth agape. Tobias sat on the step and was poked at the ground with a stick, but his ears were pricked up. Ethan saw that. Annika asked where they'd find the manpower. Ethan said there were people in the village with nowhere else to go. Widows, orphans, the elderly, those whom the Baron hasn't taken yet, but will take in a year. They need to be offered work, not charity. Work. Work and shelter in exchange for labor. A guild. Ren snorted. He said that Corvin hadn't known such words before. Ethan replied that there were many things he hadn't known before. Ren looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. He said he knew two such men, the Halley brothers, young men from the neighboring village of Ansdale. Their father owed the Baron money, and the family was driven out. The brothers wander through the woods. They make a living however they can. Not bandits, just homeless. Ethan told Ren to find them and bring them back. Ren left in the morning. He returned 2 days later. He had two men with him, Tim and Olin Halley. Both were thin, dirty, hungry, but healthy, strong, with hands that weren't afraid of hard work. Ethan fed them, showed them the farm, explained the rules. Work from dawn till dusk, 3 meals a day, a roof over their heads. 1/10 of the harvest goes into the village's communal pot. Everything else is divided equally. The brothers exchanged glances. Tim asked what the catch was. Ethan said there was no catch. There was only work. A lot of work. Tim and Olin stayed. Fall crept up like a thief. One morning, Ethan stepped out onto the porch and saw that the leaves on the birch trees had turned yellow. The air smelled different. Damp. Cool. In the mornings, steam rose from his mouth. Time was running out. He knew it. He could feel it in the bones of this foreign body that had finally begun to obey him. 2 months of non-stop work and proper food had done their job. His hands no longer shook. His legs held him up. Muscles had appeared. Not the same ones he'd had in his past life. Corvin's body was smaller and leaner, but it had become sinewy, enduring. Capable of walking 20 miles through the woods and returning with prey. In the first week of fall, Ethan started a vegetable garden. Not a small one, a real one. Behind the workshop was a vacant lot, overgrown with weeds and nettles. Ethan cleared it in 2 days. He uprooted the bushes. He dug up the soil with that same plow with a blade. He divided it into beds. But not just any beds. A system. Crop rotation. The first bed is for root vegetables. Turnips, carrots, beets. The second is for legumes. Peas, beans. They fix nitrogen in the soil. The third is for greens. Onions, garlic, cabbage. The fourth is left fallow. It rests. The following year, the crops shift to the next bed. An endless cycle. The soil doesn't get depleted. The harvest is stable. The locals used to plant the same thing in the same spot until the soil turned to dust. Then they complained about poor harvests. Ethan explained the principle to Anika. She listened with a frown. Then she said her grandmother used to do something similar. She just didn't know why. She simply rotated the crops out of habit. And her grandmothers were better than the neighbors. Ethan nodded. Sometimes folk wisdom works just as well as science. It's just that no one asks why. It was too late to plant most crops. But turnips were still in season. They grow in 2 months. Winter garlic could be planted now and harvested in the spring. Cabbage, too, late varieties. Ethan didn't know the local varieties, but Martha had the seeds. The old woman kept her seeds the way others keep gold, in little clay pots labeled with charcoal. She gave Ethan the seeds in exchange for a promise that he would return 3 times as many in the spring. Ethan promised. Martha said that if he cheated, she would personally pull out his beard. Ethan didn't have a beard. Corvin couldn't even grow stubble. But the point was clear. The garden was up and running. Annika kept an eye on the watering. Nora and Lily helped with the weeding. More precisely, Nori weeded, while Lily pulled a single weed in half an hour and spent the rest of the time catching bugs and showing them to Tobias. Tobias pretended he wasn't interested, but he was examining the bugs. Ethan saw this out of the corner of his eye and smiled inwardly. On the outside, his face was, as usual, calm and composed. He couldn't allow himself to be soft. Not now. Too much work, too little time. In the middle of the first week of fall, Ethan went into the woods with Ren and the Halley brothers. They were heading for the northern lands. Ren led the way. One-eyed and one-armed, he moved through the woods more quietly than any of them. He placed his feet so that not a single twig cracked. Ethan followed him and thought that in a past life, Ren would have been the best guide in the Rocky Mountains, even without both hands. They checked the line of traps. 2 roe deer, 5 hares, a fat badger. Badger fat is medicine, lubricant, and lamp oil. Ethan took it all. On the way back, Ren stopped. He crouched down. He pointed. Footprints. Ethan crouched down beside him. He looked, and a chill ran through him. The tracks were human. Boots. Iron-shod. 3 pairs. They led from the southern road toward the forest. Turned around at the trail, went back. Ren said quietly, "Guards. The Barons. Only they wear iron-shod boots." Ethan stood over the tracks and counted. 3 days. Footprints from 3 days ago. The guards had come into the forest 3 days ago. They looked around. Turned around. Left. They weren't hunting. They weren't patrolling. They were scouting. Havelock Marsh had sent men to see what was happening on Ethan's lands. Ethan straightened up. He told Ren they needed to hurry. Ren nodded. He understood without needing an explanation. From that day on, Ethan picked up the pace. Game was being brought to the smokehouse non-stop. Both chambers were packed with meat. The tannery he'd started building last week was finished in 3 days, a simple pit lined with stone. An oak bark for tanning, ash for softening. Ren showed Ethan a few techniques he didn't know, local methods, rough but effective. They tanned the hides together. 5 deer hides, 2 boar hides, a dozen rabbit hides. Hides aren't just for shoes. They're for belts, bags, saddles, sheaths. At the market in the nearest town, Mossbrook, a good deer hide fetched 4 silver groschen. 4 groschen was a farmhand's monthly wage. Ethan thought about the market. He'd been thinking about it for a long time. Smoked meat, tanned hides, dried fish. All of this could be sold. But he had nothing to haul it in, and he didn't know the way. And no one in Mossbrook knew him. He was a nobody, a country bumpkin with a dubious reputation. He needed a merchant, someone who knew the roads, knew the buyers, and had a wagon. And that someone found him on her own. Jenny Malroy arrived in the 3rd week of fall. A wagon, a horse. She was at the reins herself. Short, sturdy, a round face. Intelligent, quick eyes, the kind that see everything and remember everything. She made the rounds of the villages once every 2 weeks. She bought up hides, wax, wool, honey, everything the farmers could sell. She sold them in the towns. The difference in price was her livelihood. She pulled into Holmwood and immediately smelled smoke. Not from a chimney, from a smokehouse. Jenny stopped her wagon by Ethan's yard and looked. A smokehouse, made of stone, with a chimney. Hides were drying on ropes. Children were in the yard. A woman stood by the trough. A man stood at the workbench. A one-armed man was weaving nets. 2 young men were hauling firewood. Jenny tied up her horse and walked into the yard, without an invitation. She approached the smokehouse. She opened the door. She looked inside. She took out a strip of meat. She sniffed it. She tasted it. Her expression didn't change, but she chewed slowly, carefully. Then she turned to Ethan and said the meat was good, very good. She asked how much he had. Ethan told her. 100 pounds of smoked meat, 50 pounds of jerky, 5 tanned hides. Jenny narrowed her eyes. She did the math in her head. Ethan could see her lips moving. She calculated faster than anyone he knew in either world. Then she named a price. For everything. Ethan looked at her and named another. A third higher. Jenny raised an eyebrow. She asked how a country bumpkin knew city prices. Ethan said he'd guessed. Jenny didn't believe him, but she laughed. Briefly, dryly, businesslike. They haggled for 20 minutes. They settled on a price that suited them both. Jenny counted out the silver. 12 kopecks. Ethan held the coins in his palm and looked at them. Silver. The first silver in 2 years in a house where they hadn't even seen copper. Before leaving, Jenny paused. She looked at Ethan. She said she'd be back in 2 weeks. She said that if the quality remained the same, she'd be willing to buy regularly. And she said one more thing. She said that in Mossbrook, merchants from the south pay twice as much for cold smoked venison as they do for regular venison. If Ethan could produce batches of 200 pounds, she'd set him up with a steady market. Ethan said he could. Jenny nodded. She snapped her reins. She rode off. Ethan stood there with 12 pennies clenched in his fist, watching the wagon disappear. And he thought, 200 pounds. That's a lot. That means more traps, more hunters, a third smokehouse. That meant he needed to expand. Fast. Winter came early. The first frost struck in the third week of fall. A thin layer of ice formed along the edges of the stream. The grass had turned black. The children began wrapping themselves in blankets in the mornings. Ethan stood on the porch and looked at the white frost on the ground. Too early, much too early. He'd been counting on another 3 or 4 weeks of warmth. Nature had other plans. Never mind, he was ready. Not perfectly, but ready. The pantry was full. Smoked meat, dried fish, salted lard, sacks of turnips they dug up the day before the first frost, bunches of onions, garlic, a barrel of sauerkraut that Annika had fermented using her grandmother's recipe, pots of rendered fat, salt, flour he'd traded to the miller from Ansdale for 20 pounds of smoked venison. That would be enough. It had to be enough. For 10 people. For 3 months. If he counted every morsel. Ethan didn't want to count every morsel. He wanted Lily not to hide a piece of bread in her fist. He wanted Tobias not to wake up at night from hunger. He wanted little Elam to grow, not waste away. That's why he kept hunting. Every day, even in the freezing cold, even when the wind whipped his face so hard it brought tears to his eyes. Ren went with him. Tim and Olin, too. The 4 men combed the woods from dawn on. The traps worked less well in the cold. The game retreated deeper into the woods. The trails changed. But they still caught something. 1 hare a day, sometimes 2. A roe deer every 3 days. Fish from the ice fishing rods. Ethan lowered the rods into the lake through a hole in the ice. The locals didn't do that. They didn't know that fish eat in the winter, too. The first catch was 12 perch and a pike. Ren stood by the hole in the ice and watched the fish thrashing on the ice. He shook his head. He said he'd lived 40 years and hadn't known you could do that. Ethan shrugged. He said that fish don't know what winter is. By the start of winter, the farmstead was running like a well-oiled machine. Everyone knew their role. Annika ran the household. She cooked. She did the laundry. She looked after the children. She spun wool. Ren wove and mended traps. Tim and Olin hunted. Pierce was on standby. Tobias went with Ethan to the stream and to the nearby traps. Nor and Lily helped Annika. Little Ilam was growing. Slowly, but he was growing. Annika fed him porridge with bone broth. Ethan made the broth from all the bones left over from butchering. Nothing was thrown away. Bones for broth. Tendons into thread. Fat into candles. Hide into leather. Feathers into arrows. Intestines into sausage casings. Every part of the carcass was put to use. The locals threw half of it away. Ethan threw nothing away. During the first week of the real cold snap, Greta Falcon came to the farmstead. She was the very same widow from the far end of the village to whom he had brought meat a month ago. Greta didn't come alone. She was accompanied by her 2 daughters, Mira, 14, and Elka, 12. Greta stood by the fence and said nothing. For a long time. Then she said that her house had collapsed. The roof had caved in under the first snow. The walls had crumbled. The stove had cracked. They had nowhere to live. She said this in an even voice, without tears, without plea, like a fact, like someone who no longer expects anything. Ethan looked at her daughters. Mira stared at the ground. Elka looked at Ethan with the expression of a cornered animal. Ethan asked Annika, with a single glance. Annika nodded, with a single nod. Ethan told Greta that the 3rd house on the lot was empty, the one behind the barn, half ruined. But if they patched it up, it was livable. Greta looked at him. Something flickered in her eyes. She said thank you, quietly, almost inaudibly. It was the first word she'd spoken in 3 months that didn't sound like the voice of a dead person. They patched up the 3rd house in 4 days. The whole farm pitched in. Tim and Olin rethatched the roof. Ren caulked the walls. Pierce and Tobias hauled in the clay. Ethan rebuilt the stove. Annika brought blankets. Greta and her daughters moved in. 13 people on the farm. Mira turned out to be a quiet girl with golden hands. She embroidered, delicately, beautifully, patterns on fabric that would fetch a good price at any market. Ethan looked at her work and thought about it. Then he put the thought aside for later. Now was not the time for embroidery. It was winter. Winter set in earnest at the end of the first month. The snow fell thick and heavy. It blocked the road. It buried the yards. The temperature dropped every day. Ethan chipped away at the ice on the lake and checked his lines. 7 perch. Not much. The fish were heading deeper. He moved the fishing rods deeper. On the way back, he noticed smoke rising above the village, not from chimneys, from the center. From the village headman's house. He quickened his pace. He arrived, and saw what he had been expecting and fearing. A wagon, 2 horses, 2 guards by the hitching post, and Havelock Marsh on the village headman's porch. Thin, in a black cloak, with a little book in his hands, with a half-smile on his thin lips. His fingers, as always, slightly damp with ink. He was talking to Gerald. The village head stood before him, slouching, like a student before a teacher, like a debtor before a creditor. Ethan stopped a short distance away. He watched. Havelock spoke quietly, politely, with concern. Ethan couldn't hear the words, but he saw the gestures. Havelock pointed at houses. He counted. He took notes. Gerald nodded. Then Havelock took a piece of paper out of his bag. He unfolded it. He showed it to the village elder. Gerald turned pale. Havelock placed a hand on his shoulder, like a father, kindly, and said something. Gerald looked at the paper, then at Havelock, and nodded. Slowly, resignedly. Ethan didn't approach. He didn't intervene. It wasn't his place. Not yet. He returned to the farmstead. That evening, Martha arrived. Her face was ashen. She said that Havelock had offered the village a loan. Grain. 100 measures of wheat. At the winter price. Secured by 4 homesteads. The ones on the south side. 4 homesteads meant 4 families. If the grain wasn't returned with interest in the spring, the land would go to the baron. The interest was double. It's impossible to pay it back. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows it, and yet they'll take it anyway, because 100 measures of wheat means life. And without them, it means death. Martha asked what this had to do with him. Ethan said it had to do with him because if the baron took the 4 homesteads, his would be next. Martha looked at him and, for the first time in 3 months, didn't snort. She said he was right. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He sat by the stove and thought. In the morning, he made a decision. He gathered everyone at the farmstead. He said this. He was going to offer the village an alternative, not a loan, food, from the farm's reserves, for free. No collateral, no paperwork, with one condition. In the spring, those who receive food would work on the farm's communal field. 1 day for every 10 pounds of provisions. Not indentured labor. Not bondage. A simple exchange. Food now, work later. Anika asked if there were enough supplies. Ethan said there would be enough if they tightened their belts. Ren asked what would happen if there weren't enough. Ethan said that then he'd hunt more. Tim asked what would happen if the village didn't agree. Ethan said that then the village would take out a loan from the baron, and in 6 months, 4 families would become serfs. And the following winter, Havelock would come for the next 4. And so on until the entire village belonged to the baron. Tim fell silent. Olien fell silent. Ren looked at Ethan, and in his one eye there was something resembling respect. Ethan went to see the village elder. Gerald was sitting in his house, alone, at the table. In front of him lay Havelock's document. It wasn't signed yet. Ethan sat down across from him. He placed a small pouch on the table. Inside the pouch were 5 silver coins, his last ones. Jenny had paid him for the second shipment before winter. 10 coins. 5 went towards salt and iron. 5 remained. Ethan laid them out before the village elder and explained his plan. Food from the farm. For free. For the whole village. For every household. For 2 months. In exchange for work in the spring. 5 silver coins on top of that. For the community's needs. For seeds. For tools. Gerald listened. His hands lay on the table, trembling slightly. Old hands. With swollen joints. He was silent for a long time. Then he said that Ethan was crazy. He said that no one in their right mind would give away their winter supplies to strangers. Ethan said they weren't strangers. They were neighbors. Gerald looked at him with that same long gaze with which old people look at young people. And for the first time ever, he didn't look away first. Then he took Havelock's paper, slowly, carefully, folded it in 4, and put it away in his desk drawer. He said he'd think about it. He thought about it for 3 days. On the fourth day, he called a meeting. Ethan wasn't invited, an old rule. But after the meeting, Gerald came to the farm himself. He was accompanied by 4 men, the owners of the very 4 homesteads that had been put up as collateral. They stood in the yard and silently looked at the smokehouse, the tannery, the workshop, and the ropes with the dried meat. Gerald said that the village agreed. It accepted Ethan's offer. Havelock's paper would not be signed. Ethan nodded. One of the men stepped forward. A big man, bearded, with heavy hands. He said his name was Willem No. He said he didn't believe, and still didn't believe, that Corvin could be a good man. But his wife was pregnant, and his children were hungry. And if Corvin provided food, then Willem would work. Honestly, as much as needed. Ethan held out his hand. Willem looked at it, hesitated, then shook it, firmly, painfully, and walked away without looking back. Winter dragged on. The days grew short, gray. The snow lay knee-deep. The wind howled through the cracks. Ethan woke up in the dark and went to bed in the dark. Between those 2 darknesses was work. Hunting, repairs, stockpiling, inventory. Every day he counted the supplies. Every day he crossed off the list what had been eaten or distributed. The list grew shorter, slowly but surely. In the 6th week of winter, Ethan did the math and realized there wouldn't be enough to last until spring. If he continued to feed the village at the same rate, the supplies would run out 3 weeks before the thaw. 3 weeks. That's a long time. 3 weeks of starvation meant people who would start to get sick, children who would stop growing, old people who wouldn't get up from their benches. Ethan sat poring over his notes on the board. Charcoal-drawn numbers, columns, meat, fish, turnips, grain, salt, fat. He looked at those columns and thought, there was only one solution: hunt more. Not 4 men in the woods, 6. Not 20 traps, 40. Not 1 patrol line, 2. Ethan rearranged all the traps, expanded the area, ventured deeper into the northern lands, where the forest was old and dense, where the tracks of ghoul packs were visible in the snow. Long, clawed prints, deep, fresh. Wren looked at the tracks and turned pale. He said they couldn't go any further. The gulls hunt at night. But in winter, when it gets dark early, they come out at dusk too. Ethan looked at the tracks. He counted them. 5 or 6 individuals. A pack. Heading south. Toward the villages. Toward warmth. Toward livestock. Toward people. He marked the direction. He returned. He thought about it all night. A pack is a problem. But as long as they're south of the northern hunting grounds, there's more game there. The animals are fleeing from the ghouls. They're running south. That means a lot of game has gathered between the village and the pack. Deer, wild boars, hares. Everyone who fled from the predators. Ethan decided to take a chance. He set up a new line of traps 3 miles from the outermost marker. Close to the ghouls' territory. Dangerous. But the haul on the very first day was so great that Tim and Olin couldn't carry it all away in a single trip. 4 roe deer, 9 hares, 2 badgers. The forest was packed with game like a barrel of herring. For 3 weeks, Ethan made his rounds to the distant traps. Every day, in any weather, alone. He didn't take Wren with him. Wren was needed for the nearby traps. Tim and Olin were needed too. He went alone into the dark, cold forest, where the snow bore the tracks of creatures that ate people. He went with an axe and a bow, and with that calm indifference to his own safety that comes over a person when others' lives are at stake. Every evening he returned with his catch. He dragged it along, through the snow, 3 miles, sometimes 4. He'd come back wet, frozen, with stiff fingers. Annika would silently set a bowl of hot porridge in front of him and leave. She didn't ask. She didn't ask him to stop. She understood. On the 9th day of his long hunt, the ghoulie found him. He was checking a trap at the far end of the line. A roe deer. Fresh. He bent down to remove the snare and heard it. A twig snapping. Behind him. Quiet. Unnaturally quiet for a beast weighing 100 pounds. Ethan froze. He slowly turned his head. The ghoul stood 20 paces away, gray, skinny, standing on two legs but hunched over so that it looked like a four-legged creature. Its snout was elongated. Its teeth were long and yellow. Its eyes were cloudy. No pupils. The creature was looking at him and at the roe deer, deciding. Ethan slowly reached for his bow. The ghoul twitched. A low rasp. A warning. Behind it, two more emerged from behind the trees. Smaller than the first. Younger. But with the same cloudy eyes and the same teeth. A pack. 3 of them. Ethan stood with the bow in one hand and an arrow in the other. The roe deer lay between him and the ghouls. Meat. That's what they wanted. Ethan took a step back. Slowly. The lead ghoul followed his movement with its gaze. Ethan took another step. And another. Then, with a swift motion, he cut the rope holding the roe deer. The carcass fell into the snow. Ethan retreated without turning away. He didn't run. He walked backward, bow at the ready, arrow nocked. The ghouls watched him. Then the leader lowered his head toward the roe deer. He tore into it with his teeth. 2 others rushed in after him. Ethan turned around and walked quickly. He didn't run. Running attracts predators. He walked, with long strides. His heart was pounding so hard it was ringing in his ears. His hands were shaking. Not from the cold, from the adrenaline. He walked for 2 hours without stopping. When he reached the nearby traps, his legs gave out and he sat down in the snow. He sat there for 5 minutes. He caught his breath. Then he stood up and headed home. That evening, he told Ren. Ren listened in silence. Then he said the far line was closed. The ghoulie had arrived. They needed to take down the traps and move out. Ethan agreed. But 10 days of hunting in the far country had provided a stockpile that filled the gap. The pantry was full again. It wasn't bursting at the seams with supplies, but it was full. It would be enough. It would last until spring, if he counted every single piece. Ethan didn't want to count every single piece, but he had no choice. Around the same time, something else happened. Ethan was tearing up the floor in the pantry. The old boards were rotten and giving way. He was removing them to replace them. Under the third board was a crawl space. Small. Damp. Ethan reached in and felt something. A bundle. Heavy. Wrapped in oiled leather. He pulled it out. Unwrapped it. A notebook. Thick. With yellowed pages. Covered in small, neat handwriting. Ethan held it up to the candle. And froze. The text was in English. In English. Here. In a world where the English language didn't exist. His hands trembled. He sat down on the floor and began to read. Notes by a certain J.H., dated 1874. Schematics. Blueprints. A plow with a moldboard. Just like the one he'd made himself. A soap recipe. A sketch of a windmill. The design of a pump. And a diary. Fragments. Ethan read slowly. The letters danced before his eyes. The candle wax dripped. He read about a man who had ended up in this world, just like him. From another time, from 1874. An engineer, an American. He found himself in the body of a peasant. He began to build, to improve, to change, just like Ethan. Word for word, idea for idea. J.H. built a mill, set up soap production, began teaching the peasants. He was noticed. He was found. The last entry was short, hasty. The letters were jumping. The author wrote that Baron Kaltwasser knows, that he needed to head north, that if anyone found this notebook, they should run. Ethan closed the notebook, placed it on his lap. He sat in the darkness of the basement and thought. J.H. had been here, a century and a half ago, in this very house, on this very land, doing the same thing. And they found him. They stopped him. Kaltwasser, the same Baron, or his ancestor, or his title. It doesn't matter. Only one thing matters. Ethan isn't the first, and the one who came before him disappeared. He hid the notebook away again, wrapped it in leather, put it back in the crawl space, covered it with planks. Didn't tell anyone. For now. At night, he lay there thinking. He stared at the ceiling. The children were sleeping nearby. Lily was snoring softly. Tobias lay curled up on his side. Ethan looked at them and thought about how JH had probably been trying to protect someone too, and hadn't been able to, because they'd found him before he'd had a chance to become strong enough. Ethan clenched his fists under the blanket. They wouldn't find him. Not until he was ready. Winter was past its midpoint. The days were slowly growing longer. Snow still lay on the ground, but the sun was already warm. Droplets. Streams beneath the snow. The scent of the earth breaking through the frost. Ethan sensed spring long before it arrived. Corvin's body had become his own. He no longer thought of it as someone else's. These were his hands, his legs, his back. Sinewy, lean, resilient. Not the body he used to have, but a good one. A body built for work. The end of winter, the last week. The snow had begun to melt. The first day the temperature rose above zero. Ethan stood on the porch and looked out at the yard. Lily and Nor were sculpting something out of wet snow. Pierce was chopping wood. Tobias was sitting on a log, planing wood. He planed every evening. Patiently, diligently. He was making figurines. Rough, uneven, but recognizable. A wolf, a horse, a fish. He carved them out of linden wood and placed them on a shelf by the bench, his collection. Ethan watched this and felt something he didn't allow himself to feel in front of others. Warmth. Simple, quiet warmth. In the evening, a communal meal. For the first time this winter, to mark the last day of the cold spell, Annika prepared everything she had. Meat, porridge, sauerkraut, fish, turnips. The table was set in the big house. All 13 of them, at one table. The children were laughing. Elam was tapping his spoon on the table. Greta was smiling. For the first time in months, Ren ate with one hand and told a hunting tale about a moose that had gotten its antlers stuck in a tree. Tim roared with laughter so hard he nearly fell off the bench. Annika sat quietly, but her face looked different. Alive. Gentle. She looked at the table, at the people, at the children. And in her eyes was something that hadn't been there before. Peace. Spring. The snow melted quickly. The streams swelled and roared. Ethan stood on the bank of the Mern and looked at the murky water. The river carried mud, branches, and chunks of ice. In a week, the water would recede. In 2 weeks, the road would dry out. In 3 weeks, Jenny would arrive. And in a month, Havelock would arrive. Ethan knew this. Havelock would arrive and find out that the village had refused the loan. He'd find out that someone had been feeding Holmwood all winter. He'd find out who. And then the real game would begin. He needed to be ready. The first week of spring was spent planting. The vegetable garden doubled in size. Ethan enlisted the very same 4 men who had received food during the winter. They came. They worked. Willem Knoe was the first. Silently. Without a word. He plowed from dawn until dark. His wife gave birth to a boy in the middle of winter. A healthy one. Because she'd eaten every day that winter. Willem remembered that. He remembered every bite. The 4 men plowed the field in 3 days. With that same plow and moldboard. Ethan sowed the seeds. Wheat, rye, peas, turnips, cabbage, onions, garlic. Rotational cropping. Compost made from manure and rotted leaves. Watering from the stream through a ditch they dug in 2 days. Simple irrigation. A ditch from the stream to the field. The water flows through it by gravity. The locals used to carry water in buckets. Ethan dug the ditch. Jenny arrived the second week. A wagon, a horse. She was driving it herself. She drove into the yard and stopped. She looked around. The farmstead had changed over the winter. 3 houses instead of 1. 2 smokehouses, a tannery, a workshop, a vegetable garden, a stockade around the yard. Not very high. More to keep out animals than people. But still. Jenny jumped down from the wagon and walked around the yard. She looked at the smokehouses. She peeked into the tannery. She felt the hides. She nodded. Then she turned to Ethan and said he hadn't wasted any time. Ethan said he couldn't afford to. They sat down at the table. Annika brought tea, herbal tea, made with yarrow and mint. Jenny tasted it. She raised an eyebrow. She said that in town, herbal tea was sold for a copper penny a handful. Ethan took note. They discussed business. Ethan showed her the supplies: smoked venison, dried fish, tanned hides, and sausages in natural casings. Jenny did the math in her head. Her lips moved. Then she named a price. 30 kopecks for everything. Ethan shook his head. 40. Jenny narrowed her eyes. She asked since when he'd learned to haggle. Ethan said since the day people he had to feed showed up. Jenny looked at him. For a long time. Then she said 35. Ethan said 37. Jenny snorted. She held out her hand. Deal. 37 silver coins. A fortune by local standards. With that money, you could buy a horse, or 2 cows, or a year's supply of grain. Ethan didn't buy a horse or a cow. He bought tools. 2 saws, 3 axes, 10 pounds of iron ingots for Mayrin, nails, staples, 2 coils of rope, a barrel of tar, glass, real glass, 2 panes, small, cloudy, expensive, but glass, windows. Until then, the farmhouses had used bull bladders or rags instead of windows. Glass means light. Light in winter, when the days are short, means 2 extra hours of work. Mayrin received the iron and looked at it as if it were a Christmas present. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the ingots. Ethan noticed. He said nothing. Before leaving, Jenny lingered. She asked Ethan to step aside. They stood by the fence. Jenny spoke softly. She said there were rumors circulating in Mossbrook about a village that had refused the Baron's loan, about a man who fed the whole county, and about smoke rising from the smokehouses. The rumors had reached the Baron's court. Havelock knows. Havelock knows everything. Jenny said she trades throughout the county and knows how the Baron operates. First, the paperwork, then the people. If the paperwork doesn't work, the Baron sends guards. If the guards don't work, the Baron sends armored soldiers. She said this while looking him in the eye. No smile, no irony, like a warning. Ethan asked why she was telling him this. Jenny paused. Then she said she had 3 warehouses and 2 wagons and the best trade connections in the county, and not a single person worth getting up for in the morning. Ethan was silent. Jenny said she'd be back in 2 weeks, with 2 wagons, and with an offer. A business proposal. She snapped her reins and rode off. Ethan stood by the fence and watched her go. Jenny Malroy, a merchant, a loner, a woman who calculates faster than she thinks, who measures everything in pennies, and who had just told him she had no one to live for. He went back to the workshop. He took a piece of linden wood. That evening, he carved a small box out of it, with leather loops, with a bone clasp. Smooth on the inside, sanded down, for papers, so they wouldn't get wet on the road. A trifle. A trifle. But when Jenny arrived 2 weeks later, and he silently placed the box on her wagon, she took it, turned it over in her hands, opened it, closed it. She ran her finger over the clasp. She didn't say a word, but she looked away for a second, and when she turned back, her eyes were different. Jenny brought what she'd promised, a proposal. She wanted to become the farm's exclusive trading partner. Everything the farm produced would go through her: meat, hides, fish, and future products. In return, she would handle sales, logistics, and connections. She'd take 20%. Ethan listened. 20% was a lot, but he didn't have a wagon. He didn't have connections. He didn't have a name in the market. Jenny had all of that. He offered 15. Jenny raised an eyebrow. They haggled for an hour. They settled on 17. They shook hands. Jenny smiled and said he haggled like a merchant, not a farmer. Ethan said he wasn't a farmer. Jenny asked, "Then who are you?" Ethan paused. Then he said he was a man who gets things done. Jenny looked at him. For a long time. She nodded. She drove away. The next day, Soyeon came to the farm. Ethan found her in the morning, at the gate, on the ground, unconscious. She was lying face down in the mud. Her clothes were torn. There was a wound on her back. Long, deep, caked with blood. Ethan turned her over. Thin, dark-skinned. A long black braid tangled and caked with dirt. Her face was angular, high cheekbones, different features. Not local. Not the kind he'd seen in this world. Ethan lifted her and carried her into the house. He laid her on a bench. Annika brought water. Ethan washed the wound, deep but clean. Not a tear, a cut, a knife or a sword. He applied a poultice of yarrow to the wound, bandaged it with strips of cloth, gave her willow decoction to drink. Fever. High. She was delirious, speaking in a language no one in the house understood. Ethan listened. At first, he couldn't make it out. Then, word by word, fragments, distorted, slurred but recognizable. Korean. She was speaking Korean, old Korean, changed over the centuries, but Korean. Ethan froze over her with a rag in his hand and felt a chill run down his spine. Korean. Here, in a world where Korea didn't exist. J.H.'s notebook flashed before his eyes. He wasn't the first. There had been many. And So-yeon. Who is she? A descendant of one of the others. It took her 3 days to come to. On the 4th day, she opened her eyes. Dark, clear, frightened. She saw Ethan. She flinched, tried to sit up. He gently held her by the shoulder, told her she was safe. He told her the wound was clean and healing. So-yeon looked at him. Then she asked where she was. Her voice was hoarse, weak, but she spoke the local language, fluently, without an accent. She spoke the language of this world as if it were her native tongue. Ethan replied that she was in Holmwood, by the Mern stream. She closed her eyes. She lay there for a minute. Then she asked who he was. Ethan said his name was Corvin, and that she had nothing to fear. So-yeon opened her eyes again. She looked at him, and said she didn't remember anything. Didn't remember where she'd come from. Didn't remember who'd wounded her. Didn't remember her life before she'd woken up in the forest a week ago. Blanks. A void. She remembered her name, So-yeon Park. Nothing else. Ethan nodded. He didn't press her for details. He didn't push her. He said there was plenty of time. Let her rest. Annika brought her some broth. Lily walked over and silently placed one of Tobias's figurines next to her on the bench. A little horse. So-yeon looked at the little horse, then at Lily, and for the first time in 4 days, she smiled. Faintly, pale, but she smiled. Lily smiled back. Something clicked between them, instantaneous, childlike, unconditional. So-yeon recovered quickly. She was back on her feet in a week. 2 weeks later, she was walking around the yard. The wound had healed. Ethan changed her bandages every day and made sure there was no infection. There wasn't. The yarrow was working. The willow decoction was bringing down her fever. In the 3rd week, So-yeon went out into the woods. Ethan walked with her. She stopped by a bush and bent down. She plucked a leaf, crumpled it between her fingers, sniffed it, and said it was gravelat, that the root is used for intestinal inflammation, that if mixed with chamomile, the effect is stronger. Ethan looked at her. She spoke with the confidence of someone who knows herbs like the back of her hand. But the names she used were different, not local, not the ones Ethan knew, a different tradition, a different school, Eastern. He asked how she knew. So-yeon fell silent. She frowned. She said she didn't know where it came from. She just knew. Her hands remembered. Her mind remembered. And everything else was a blank. Ethan was silent the whole way home. He was thinking, So-yeon knows herbs. She knows medicine. But she doesn't know where she learned it. She speaks Korean in her sleep. But she doesn't know Korean. Or she thinks she doesn't. She's a descendant of one of the previous time travelers. The knowledge was passed down from generation to generation. The language had become archaic. The memory had faded. But her hands remembered. Her body remembered. Just as his body remembered how to shoot a bow. So-yeon Park was living proof of what J.H. had written in his notebook. There had been many transmitters. They left their mark. Not all of them were found. Not all of them were eliminated. Some survived. They fled. They hid, and their descendants still roamed this world.
Not knowing who they were, not knowing where their knowledge came from,
Not knowing that they were the heirs of masters from another world. Ethan buried that thought deep inside. He didn't say a word to Soyeon. It wasn't the right time. She was wounded, frightened. Her memory was gone. Pressuring her now would mean shattering the trust that had only just begun to form. He would wait. He knew how to wait. 20 years in the mountains of Montana had taught him one thing. Patience is not weakness. Patience is a trap. So-yeon became the farm's healer within a month. Not because Ethan appointed her, because people came on their own. First, Annika. Elam was teething, and the boy cried out at night. So-yeon ground gravellata root with honey and rubbed it on his gums. Elam quieted down within 10 minutes. Annika looked at So-yeon as if she were a miracle. Then Martha came with her joint pain. So-yeon examined her hands. She massaged each finger. She asked some questions. Then she brewed a tea from 3 herbs she'd gathered in the forest that morning. Martha drank it for 3 days. On the 4th day, she came back and said her joints hurt less than they did with willow bark. So-yeon nodded and said that in a week, the pain would be gone entirely. Martha looked at her, squinting. She asked who she was. Yeon replied that she didn't know. Martha snorted and left. But she came back 3 days later, with a pie and some cabbage. Ethan watched So-yeon and learned. She knew things he didn't. Different plants, different methods. He knew Western field medicine. She knew Eastern medicine. Together they covered almost everything that could happen in the village without surgery or antibiotics. Cuts, bruises, dislocations, fever, intestinal illnesses, toothaches, inflammation, infant colic. Women's issues about which Ethan knew nothing, but So-yeon knew everything. Women from the village began coming to her. Quietly, in the evenings, through the back gate, so their husbands wouldn't see. So-yeon saw everyone, silently, without questions. She treated them, bandaged them, brewed remedies. Sometimes she just listened. The women came back, again and again. Lily became attached to So-yeon instantly. She followed her around like a shadow. She helped gather herbs, sort leaves, grind roots in a mortar. So-yeon taught her the names of the plants. Lily repeated them diligently, getting half of them wrong. One evening, So-yeon was braiding Lily's hair. The girl sat on her lap, swinging her legs. So-yeon braided her hair and spoke softly. Ethan walked by and stopped. So-yeon looked up. She looked at him and said that Lily had a kind father. Ethan turned away. Quickly. He walked around the corner. He stood there for a moment. He came back. His face was calm. But So-yeon could see. She could see what he was hiding. She didn't say anything. She just kept braiding the hair. In the 3rd week of spring, Hazel Wynn arrived at the farm. She didn't walk in. She crawled in, wearing a dirty raincoat, with her feet bloodied and bruised, with slender hands that had never held anything heavier than a pen. She was lying by the gate, just like So-yeon a month ago, but without a wound, just completely exhausted. Ethan picked her up, carried her into the house. Annika gave her some water. So-yeon examined her. Exhaustion, dehydration, blisters on her feet, burst and inflamed. The girl had walked, for a long time. 3 days, maybe 4. When she came to, she tried to lie. She said she was a peasant girl, from a distant village. Ethan looked at her straight back, even as she lay on the bench, at her clear pronunciation, free of a rural accent, at her hands, free of calluses except for those from walking. He didn't expose her. He said they were glad to have her, that she should rest, that food would be ready in an hour. Hazel turned out to be exactly who he thought she was, the youngest daughter of a minor nobleman. The Winnow family had once owned 3 villages. Baron Kaltwasser had ruined them in 2 years. Her father drank away what was left, and then he decided to sell the only thing he had left, his daughter, to marry her off to the Baron's 50-year-old castellan, a fat old man with rotten teeth, in exchange for a position at court and the forgiveness of their debts. Hazel found out and ran away. At night, just as she was. She walked for 4 days, slept in ditches, ate berries from the bushes. She came to Holmwood because she'd heard that a man here gave shelter to all sorts of people. She told Ethan this a week later, when she realized he wouldn't turn her in. She told him matter-of-factly, without tears. But her hands were shaking. Ethan listened. Then he asked what she could do. Hazel fell silent. For a long time. Then she said quietly, nothing. She couldn't do anything. Read, write, count. She knows the law. She knows history. She can compose a letter. She can keep records. But with her hands, nothing. Not even bake bread. Not even light the stove. Not even milk a goat. Nothing that matters here. Ethan looked at her. He said that reading and counting matter everywhere. He said there were 20 children in the village and not a single one of them knew the alphabet. Hazel looked up. Something flashed in her eyes. Not hope. Surprise. That someone considered this important. The next day, Ethan gave her a job. To teach the children. Everyone who came. Literacy, arithmetic, the basics. Hazel started with the children from the farmstead. Tobias, Lily, Pierce, Nor, Mira, Elk, 6 of them. She seated them on benches in the workshop. She gave each one a small board and a piece of charcoal. She started with the letters. Her voice trembled for the first 10 minutes. Then it steadied. She explained clearly, patiently, without irritation. Tobias traced the letters in silence, neatly, slowly, just as he carved spoons, with the same stubborn precision. Lily drew big, crooked letters and giggled when they looked like a beetle. Pierce wrote quickly and sloppily. Nor wrote slowly and neatly. Mira stared silently at her slate and blushed when Hazel praised her. A week later, children from the village arrived. 2, then 4, then 7. Hazel taught them all, every day, for 2 hours. And every evening, Ethan watched her sit by candlelight and draw up a plan for the next day, in neat letters on birch bark. She had found her place. But Xavier had brought more than just literacy with her. She brought information. She knew the Baron's court. She knew how Kaltwasser operated. She knew his weaknesses, his debts, his fears. She knew the law, the real law. Not village customs, but the laws that governed these lands. And one evening she told Ethan something that changed his plan. She said that according to the Charter of Free Communities, signed by the Barons 40 years ago, any community of 3 or more villages has the right to declare itself a free district if it gathers the signatures of 2/3 of the household heads. A free district pays taxes directly to the count, bypassing the Baron. The Baron loses the right to collect taxes. He loses his claim to the land. He loses everything. Ethan listened. Then he asked if Kaltwasser knew this. Hazel nodded. Of course he knows. That's exactly why he's buying up the villages, so there won't be any free communities left that could unite. Ethan sat in silence. A picture was forming in his mind. 3 villages. Holmwood, Ansdale, where the Halley brothers came from, Millville. 3 villages on the Mern River. If they were united into a free district, the Baron would lose control over the entire left bank. Hazel looked at him. She could see him thinking. She saw something in his eyes, something big. She blushed and looked away. At the end of the month, the last one arrived. Brilla 10. Brilla. Ethan heard a noise at the gate that morning. He went out. A woman was standing at the gate, tall, fair-haired, broader in the shoulders than he was. A scar across her eyebrow, a sword at her belt, chainmail under her cloak, a swaggering gait, like someone used to marching in formation. She looked down at Ethan and said she'd heard they took in all sorts of people here. Ethan said they did. She nodded. Then she challenged him to a fistfight to see if he was worth obeying. Ethan looked at her fists, which were as big as his head. And he said he didn't fight people he needed to keep alive and in one piece. Bree laughed, loudly, so the whole yard could hear. Lily peeked out from around the corner. Tobias stepped out onto the porch. Bree looked at them and her laughter. She said, "Fine, let him feed me then. We'll talk later." The summer of the first year. The farmstead had grown to 20 people, 20 mouths to feed, 4 buildings. The smokehouses were running non-stop. The tannery was producing 2 hides a week. The vegetable garden was green. The first harvest of peas had already been gathered. The cabbage was growing. The wheat was heading in the field they'd plowed in the spring with a moldboard plow. Ethan stood at the edge of the field and looked at the ears of wheat. Green, heavy, robust. In the neighboring fields of the village, the wheat was sparse and pale. The soil was depleted. The same crop in the same spot for 20 years in a row. His field yielded twice as much. The difference was plain to see. The village saw it. The village whispered. Ethan began working on the merger, quietly, without fanfare. He went to Ansdale, a 2-hour walk along the trail by the river. A small village. 10 homesteads. Half belonged to the Baron. Half were still unclaimed. The headman of Ansdale was a young man named Fen Grau, 30 years old, sturdy, with intelligent eyes and a wary expression. He'd heard of Ethan. The whole county had. The man from Holmwood who feeds the village and does strange things. Fen met him at the gate. He didn't invite him inside. They stood in the street. They talked. Ethan didn't beat around the bush. He spoke plainly. The Baron would take over Ansdale in 2 years. Loans, debts, papers. It's a familiar scheme. Fen knows this. Everyone knows this. The only way to stop it is the Free District. 3 villages, Holmwood, Ansdale, and Milltown. Signatures from the heads of households. A charter. A direct tax on the Earl. The Baron loses his power. Fen listened. His expression didn't change. Then he asked what would be in return. Ethan said that in return, Ansdale would receive a plow with a moldboard, a smokehouse, seeds on a rotation basis, marketing for hunters and trap hunting, and protection, collective protection, from the Baron.
From the ghouls. From everyone, Fen thought, for a long time.
Then he said he'd talk to the men, but he wouldn't promise anything. It was more complicated with the miller. The village lay further up the river, near the old mill that hadn't been working for 5 years. The miller had died. There were no heirs. The mill was rotting away. Without the mill, the village had to haul its grain to the Baron's town to be ground. They paid triple the price. The village elder of Melnichny was an old man named Ulf Burke, 70 years old, deaf in one ear, stubborn as a rock. He trusted no one. Not the Baron, not the neighbors, and certainly not that former drunk from Holmwood. Ethan went to see him and was turned down within 5 minutes. Ulf said he could do without outsiders' schemes. He said his village had stood for 100 years and would stand for another 100. Ethan didn't argue. He went back. But before leaving, he said one thing. He said he could fix the mill. Ulf fell silent mid-sentence. He looked at him. Ethan said he knew how a water wheel worked. He knew how to fix the drive mechanism and the millstone. If Ulf gave him access to the mill, he'd fix it in 2 weeks. For free. On one condition, the mill would become part of the Free District. Ulf was silent for a long time. Then he said he'd consider it once he saw it, not before. Ethan spent 10 days at the mill. He went there every morning. He returned in the evening. Myron helped. She forged the parts. The axle, the gears, the brackets. Ethan designed. She brought his designs to life. They worked side by side, and Ethan noticed that Myron had changed. She had become quieter, more attentive. She listened to his explanations with such concentration that it seemed she was memorizing every word. Once, he explained the principle of the gear ratio to her. How a small gear turns a large one. How speed is exchanged for power. Myron was silent. Then she spoke softly. She said he was the only man who looked her in the eyes instead of over her shoulder. Ethan didn't understand at first. Then he did. And he didn't know what to say. Myron wasn't expecting an answer. She turned toward the millstone and began to work. Her back was straight. Her shoulders were broad. Her hands were steady. And Ethan thought she was beautiful. Not in the way beauty is understood in this world. Different. Truly beautiful. The mill was repaired in 12 days. The water wheel started turning. The millstone began grinding. The first sack of flour came out white and fine. Ulf stood nearby and watched. He touched the flour with his fingers, rubbed it, sniffed it. Then he turned to Ethan and said 2 words. "It's fixed, it then." Ethan nodded. Ulf paused. Then he said he'd talk to the men. A week later, Milltown sent a reply. They agreed on the condition that the mill remain communal and that milling for locals be free. Ethan agreed. Ansdale replied sooner. Fenn came himself with 3 men. They brought the signatures, 6 out of 8 freehold farms. 2/3. That was enough. Ethan looked at those signatures. Clumsy crosses on birch bark. People who couldn't write had made crosses. Each cross represented a person who had decided to take a risk. Who had believed, not in Ethan, but in the idea. The idea that it was possible to live differently. Hazel drafted the charter. Beautiful. Clear. In proper legal language. The charter declared Holmwood, Ansdale, and Melnichno to be the Free District of Myrna, citing the Charter of Free Communities, signed by the household heads. Bearing the village headman's seal, which Gerald affixed with a trembling hand. A copy was sent to the Count, via Jenny. She personally took the document to the Earl's chancery. The original remained with Ethan. He hid it in the secret compartment, next to J.H.'s notebook. The Baron's reaction was not long in coming. 10 days after the charter was sent, Havelock Marsh arrived in Holmwood. Not alone. With 4 guards. Not 2, as usual. 4. He stopped at the village headman's house. Gerald came out. He turned pale. Havelock was smiling, as always. A half smile, sweaty fingers, the little book. He said that alarming rumors had reached the Baron, that someone in Holmwood was sowing discord, that someone was inciting the communities to revolt. He said it gently, sympathetically, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis. Gerald stood as white as a sheet. Ethan approached. He stood next to the village headman. Havelock looked at him. For the first time, they stood face to face. Havelock was thin and tall. His face was narrow. His eyes were light, attentive, piercing. He looked at Ethan, and Ethan could see him assessing him, reading him, weighing him up. A skinny former drunk, Corvin. It had to be Corvin. But there was something in this Corvin's eyes that Havelock couldn't read. Something unfamiliar. Havelock said that the charter for the Free District was illegal, that the signatures had been collected by deception, that the Baron wouldn't recognize it. Ethan replied calmly. He said that the charter was drawn up in accordance with the Charter of Free Communities, that the signatures were collected voluntarily, that a copy had been sent to the Count. Havelock smiled even wider. He said the Count was far away, but the Baron was close by, and that the Baron didn't like it when peasants forgot their place. Ethan looked at him and said one thing. He said a peasant's place was on his own land, and that no one would drive them from that land. Havelock fell silent. The smile didn't fade, but his eyes grew cold. He nodded, jotted something down in his notebook, mounted his horse, and rode off, with 4 guards. Ethan stood and watched him go. Gerald stood nearby. The village elder's hands were shaking. He said that Ethan had just signed their death sentence. Ethan said the sentence had been signed long ago when the Baron decided this land was his. Now they had simply refused to accept it. Ethan knew the blow was coming. The question wasn't if, but when. He gave Bree 2 months. 2 months to turn the village men into a militia. Bree worked like a dog, up before dawn. Roll call, drill, running, archery, hand-to-hand combat, discipline. 15 men from 3 villages. Not one of them had ever held anything more dangerous than an axe. Bree drove them to the point of nausea. She yelled so loudly that the birds flew from the trees. But after 2 months, the 15 men knew how to stand in formation. They knew how to fire in unison on command. They knew how to retreat without breaking ranks. They knew how to stand guard at night. Not soldiers, not even militiamen in the full sense of the word, but men who wouldn't run away at the sight of a guard. Myrene was forging arrowheads, knives, axes, 2 crossbows. Ethan had drawn her a blueprint for a crossbow with a crank, a simple mechanism, a lever that pulls the bowstring taut. It shoots 100 paces. It pierces chainmail at 50. It took Myrene a week to make the first crossbow, the second in 4 days, the third in 3. Each subsequent one was better. Harold watched his daughter work and said nothing. But one day he approached Ethan and said that if the Baron came, he, Harold, would stand at the gate. With a hammer. Ethan nodded. He didn't say thank you, he just nodded. Between them, that was enough. Ethan wasn't preparing for a fight. He was preparing the forest. Every evening after work, he would head out to the northern lands. Whole, with an axe and a rope. He set traps, not for animals, for people. Wolf pits on the trails, twine snares, fallen trees blocking the path, ambush points. Ethan had no intention of fighting in the open. 15 men with bows against armored soldiers is suicide. But 15 men in a forest they know like the back of their hand, against armored soldiers who don't know the woods, that's a different story. The forest was his territory. Every trail, every ravine, every tree. He'd been walking through it for a year. He knew where to go and where not to go, where there were swamps and where there was solid ground, where you could hide and where you'd be spotted 100 paces away. Ren helped. The one-armed hunter set traps with a skill that even Ethan respected. The blow came at the end of summer. It had been 1 year and 3 months since the day Ethan woke up on the earthen floor. That morning, Ren came running back from the distant lookout. His face was ashen. His one eye was ablaze. Men in armor. 20, maybe 25. They were coming from the Baron's castle, along the southern road, on horseback, fully armed, chainmail, helmets, spears, swords. With them was Havelock Marsh riding a chestnut horse, and an empty wagon. Why an empty wagon? For people, for those they'll take away, for the serfs who will be carted off to the Baron's estates. Ethan gathered the men, quickly, without panic. Bree lined up the militia, 15 men, bows, 3 crossbows, axes, knives. Soyan laid out bandages and herbs in the house. Hazel gathered the children and women, led them to the house in the back. Tobias didn't want to leave. He stood at the gate with a small bow. His face was pale, his jaw was clenched. Ethan walked over to him. He crouched down. He looked him in the eyes. He told him he needed Tobias to be inside the house, not because he was small, but because if anything happened to Ethan, Tobias would have to lead Lily through the forest to the north, to those trails they'd walk together. Tobias knows them. He's the only one who does. The boy stood there and listened. Then he nodded. Once. And went into the house. He didn't look back. Ethan watched him go and thought that a 6-year-old boy shouldn't be given orders like that. But the world didn't ask what should be. Ethan didn't wait behind the stockade. He led the detachment into the forest, to the positions he'd been preparing for 2 months. Bree commanded the formation. Ren led the reconnaissance, Tim and Olin on the flanks. Willem Knock in the center with a crossbow. Ethan in front, alone, to meet them. The armored soldiers were coming down the southern road, in a column, on horseback. Their helmets glinted in the sun. Spears jutted out like a forest. At the front was the commander, an old knight with a graying beard, scars on his face, a man who had seen dozens of skirmishes. Next to him was Havelock, on horseback, in a black cloak, with a little book. The first trap was set at the fork in the road, a wolf pit. The lead horse sank into it. It collapsed. The rider was thrown head first. The clang of iron. A scream. The column came to a halt. The commander bellowed orders. The soldiers dismounted. They turned around. Arrows flew from the forest. 3, 4, 5. One soldier fell, clutching his leg. The arrows weren't poisoned, but they were wrapped in a rag soaked in elderberry juice. Not fatal, but the wound becomes inflamed. It burns. It takes a man out of action for days. The armored soldiers left the road and entered the forest, and the forest took them in. Barricades on the trails, tripwires, pits. Every 20 paces something broke, something snapped, something fired. Ethan and Ren had set the traps so that the squad couldn't move in a straight line. Every step to the side, every turn. The armored soldiers marched for an hour and covered 300 paces. They lost 6 to wounds, not a single casualty. Ethan didn't want to kill anyone. These were strangers whom the Baron had sent to their deaths. They had children too. 3 days. 3 days of skirmishes in the forest. Traps and ambushes by day, raids by night. Bree led the 3 quietest men to the plate-armored soldiers' camp. They didn't attack. They made noise. They snapped branches. They threw rocks. They shouted from the darkness. The armored men weren't sleeping. 3 days. Exhausted, hungry, angry. Their commander knew he was losing. Not the battle, The war of nerves. He had come to crush the village, but the village had dissolved into the forest and was biting at him from all sides. On the third night, Ethan made a decision. He left his bow behind. He took an axe, a smoked ham, a loaf of bread that Annika had baked that morning, a flask of broth, and he set off alone toward the Baron's camp. Bree said he was crazy. Ren said he was a dead man. Ethan told them to wait. If he didn't return by dawn, they were to lead the people north. And he left. The Baron's camp. Campfires. Guards. The wounded were moaning. Ethan emerged from the forest with his hands raised, palms open and facing forward. A guard spotted him and raised his spear. Ethan said he'd come to talk. The sentry called for the commander. An old knight stepped out toward the fire. He looked at Ethan. He recognized him. He smiled. He said he remembered him, Corvin the drunkard, the one who'd been puking in the ditch by the Baron's gates. Ethan nodded. He said that was in a past life. He set a ham, a loaf of bread, and a flask on the ground. He sat down across from the knight and began to speak. He spoke quietly, simply, without fanfare. He said the knight's soldiers hadn't had a hot meal in 3 days. He said 6 were wounded, 2 seriously. He said he had a wife and children in Homewood, and the knight's soldiers also had wives and children at home. He didn't want to kill. He didn't want to be killed. Here's what he proposed. He would feed the knight's soldiers dinner, alone, unarmed. And then the knight would leave. Not because he'd lost, but because Ethan didn't want to kill him. The knight was silent. He chewed on his mustache. He looked at the ham, at the loaf of bread, at Ethan, for a long time. Then he took off his helmet, set it on the ground, and said, "Take in the meat, fool." Dawn. Ethan was walking back. His legs felt like cotton. His hands were shaking. Not from the cold, from the tension finally easing. 3 days without sleep, 3 nights on his feet, and 1 conversation by the campfire that was worth more than any battle. The knight kept his word. At dawn, the Baron's detachment broke camp. They headed south, along the road, in silence, without banners. The wounded were loaded onto horses. The wagon left empty. Havelock rode last. He turned around. He looked at the forest, at the village beyond the forest, at the smoke rising from the smokehouses. And there was no malice in his gaze. There was something worse. Patience. Havelock Marsh knew how to wait. Ethan emerged from the woods toward the farmstead gate, and he stopped. Everyone was standing at the gate, the entire community. Annika holding Elam in her arms. Pierce, holding an axe that looked both ridiculous and touching in his hands. Ren, holding a knife. Tim and Olden, dirty and exhausted. Willem Knock, with his shoulder bandaged. Mayrin was black with soot. She had been forging non-stop for all 3 days. Arrowheads, bolts for crossbows, staples for traps. Soyen with bandages across her shoulder, her hands covered in dried blood, not her own. Wounded militiamen. Hazel with the ledger. She kept track of the arrows. Every bolt, every arrowhead, every single one. Bree with a bow on her back and a bruise under her eye. Ethan didn't know where the bruise came from. Greta and her daughters, Martha. Old Martha, who stood upright and held a pot of porridge in her hands. Village elder Gerald, blacksmith Harold. The widows, the hunters, the children, everyone. And leading the way were Tobias and Lily. Lily ran up first, as always, at a run. She buried her face in his stomach. She hugged him, tightly, so tightly that Ethan felt the strength in the 4-year-old girl's arms. Tobias came up next, not running, walking, serious, upright. He walked over and stood beside him. He looked up at Ethan and spoke calmly, steadily, in a grown-up voice that 6-year-olds don't have. He said they'd been waiting for him, and that breakfast was ready. Ethan looked at his son, at the boy who, a year ago, had shielded his sister from his father's fists, who had stood by the broken as white as chalk and waited for the blow. This boy stood before him and said that breakfast was ready. Ethan placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, gently, almost weightlessly. Tobias didn't flinch. He didn't tense up, for the first time. He accepted the touch, as if it were natural, as if it were normal, as if it were something fathers do. Anika approached. She looked at him. Her eyes were dry. She wasn't crying. She wasn't the type to cry in front of others, but her gaze said it all. She held out a mug to him. Hot broth. He took it. His hands were shaking. Anika placed her palm over his, for a second, then she withdrew it, and walked over to the stove. Ethan stood in the middle of the courtyard with the mug in his trembling hands. Around him were people who could have died 3 days ago, and who were now standing there, alive. All of them. Every single one. Not a single casualty, on either side. It was his victory, not by the sword, not by cunning, food, a leg of meat and a loaf of bread. The day after the battle passed in silence. People rested, slept, ate, repaired what was broken. Ethan slept until noon. For the first time in a year, he woke up to find Lily sitting next to him, quietly running her fingers through his hair. Like a doll. He didn't move. He lay there and listened as she hummed something to herself. A melody he didn't know. A children's song. Someone else's. From this world. He lay there and thought that for this alone, it had been worth going into the enemy's camp at night. That evening, he opened J.H.'s notebook, that very one from the secret hiding place. He'd already read it 3 times, but each time he found something new. This time he read more slowly, more carefully, and found an entry he'd missed before. On the last page, in small handwriting. Hasty, almost illegible. J.H. wrote that he thought it wasn't chance that had brought them here, that they were being called, that something in this world was breaking, and the world was clawing out of another world those who could fix it. But someone really didn't want them to fix it. Ethan sat poring over those lines and felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. They're being called, not thrown here, called. The world itself is pulling them here. From different eras, from different countries, engineers, craftsmen, those who know how to fix things. And someone is killing them. Methodically, generation after generation. Who? The Order of the Bright Circle. The Barons. Someone else. Someone who needs this world to remain broken. So that peasants plow with a plow. So that children die of hunger. So that the barons collect a tithe and the priests a 20th. And everything stays as it was. For centuries. Ethan closed his notebook. He put it away in the secret compartment. He stood up. Stepped out onto the porch. Stood there and watched the sunset. Red. Heavy. On the horizon, a dark strip of the wild frontier. Where Soyeon had come from. Where the ghoul packs had come from. Where the wind blew, smelling of something old and dangerous. Ethan stood there and thought. He is no victim of chance. He's a master who's been called upon. This world has a client, and that client has an enemy. And Ethan stands between them. With an axe in one hand and a smoked ham in the other, he smirked. In a Montanese way. Dryly. Well then. Fine. He'll fix this damn world. If they let him. These days, Ethan made another decision. He told Soyeon. Not everything, just part of it. He showed her the notebook. He showed her the notes in English. Soyeon looked at the letters she didn't recognize and remained silent. Then Ethan said that she speaks in her sleep in a language no one here knows. Soyeon turned pale. He said gently that she shouldn't be afraid, that he thinks she's a descendant of someone from another world, that the knowledge she held in her hands was a legacy, that she wasn't alone. Soyeon sat there for a long time, a very long time. Then she looked up. There were tears in her eyes. She asked quietly, "So she isn't crazy? So the voices in her head that tell her the names of herbs aren't madness. They're memories. Someone's memories." Ethan nodded. Soyeon covered her face with her hands and sat like that for a minute. When she removed her hands, her face was wet but calm. She said one word. "Thank you." A year had passed. A full year since the day the Baron's detachment left Holmwood. Much had changed. Ethan's farmstead had become a village. 32 people, 7 buildings. The palisade had been expanded and reinforced. A watchtower stood on the hill. The mill in Melnichno operated without interruption. Flour was distributed to all 3 villages. Every farm had a plow with a moldboard. Ansdale and Melnichno harvested their first crop using crop rotation and yielded twice as much grain as in previous years. Jenny transported goods from the Free District to 4 towns. Smoked meat, hides, sausages, flour, Soyeon's herbal blends, Mira's embroidery, wooden crafts from Ethan's workshop.
Money was flowing in, not like a river, more like a trickle, but a steady one.
Silver flowed into the communal treasury managed by Hazel. She started a ledger, a real one, on good quality paper that Jenny had brought back from the city. Every penny was recorded, every entry, income, expenses, debts, supplies. Hazel kept the books so neatly and accurately that Jenny once said she was better at accounting than any town treasurer. Hazel blushed to the roots of her hair, and she stole a glance at Ethan. Had he noticed? He had. Ethan saw how Hazel was looking at him. He'd seen it for a long time, that bright, youthful gaze, her first great crush. He was 15 years older than her and remembered it every second. He neither encouraged nor rebuffed her. He treated her impartially, like a father. He gave her work to do. He valued her work. He told her it was important, but not in the way she wanted. Hazel sensed this, and she accepted it, because being needed is a lot too, even if it's not quite what you dream of. Bree led the militia every day, 30 men now, from 3 villages, archers with bows and crossbows, guards, patrols, not an army, but a force to be reckoned with. Bree strolled through the village with a sword at her belt and a joke on her lips. She loved making Ethan blush in front of Hazel. She'd say something suggestive in a loud voice. Hazel would turn crimson. Ethan would turn away. Bree would cackle. Tobias watched it all with the expression of a little old man who had seen too much of the foolishness of adults. Lily giggled, not understanding. The Free District of Myrna had existed for half a year already. The Count had sent a reply to the letter. Dry. Formal. The Count recognized the district with a caveat. The tax had to be paid in full by fall. Ethan paid it, in silver, from the district's treasury. Jenny personally took the money herself. Baron Kaltwasser hadn't recognized anything, but after his detachment's defeat, he fell silent. For half a year. Havelock hadn't come. The guards hadn't shown up. Silence. Ethan knew that silence was more dangerous than noise. Silence meant that the Baron was thinking, planning, seeking allies. And when he struck again, it would be more serious than 25 lancers. And the Baron struck. At the end of the second summer. Not alone. With a neighbor. Baron Ortwin Kaltwasser and Baron Dirk Hohenmarsch. 2 baronies, combined forces, nearly 100 armored men, mounted, on foot, with a supply train, with siege ladders. This was no punitive expedition. This was war. Jenny brought the news a week before they arrived. She'd learned it from her people in Mosbrook. Ethan listened and did the math. 100 armored men against 30 militiamen, 3-1. In open combat, it's a rout. In the woods, the odds are better, but 100 isn't the same as 25. The traps will run out. The arrows will run out. The men will grow tired. They won't last 3 days. Ethan called a council, all the key people. Bree, Wren, Jenny, Hazel, Mayrin, Soyan, Annika, Gerald. Fen Grau from Ansdale, Ulf Burke from Millville. The old miller came himself, in a wagon. Deaf in one ear. But he came. They sat at a table in the big house. Ethan laid out the situation. No sugarcoating. 100 men in chainmail. In a week. We don't stand a chance in battle. Bree confirmed it. 30 men with bows against 100 in chainmail. It's a meat grinder. Hazel raised her hand. Everyone looked at her. She said she'd sent a copy of the Free District's charter not only to the Count. She'd sent a copy to the Imperial Court. To the capital. Through a merchant Jenny had found. The charter of the free communities is imperial law. Not baronial. Not counts. Imperial. 2 barons are waging war against the Free District. That's a violation of imperial law. If word reaches the capital that the barons are suppressing a lawful community by force, the emperor will intervene. But the capital is far away. A response will take months to arrive, and the armored troops will be here in a week. Ethan nodded. He said they needed to hold out for a week. Not to win, to hold out, to stand their ground, to show that the Free District is alive, that it can't be crushed in a single blow. Jenny said she'd head south. Not to flee, to work, to stir things up. She'll tell the merchants. She'll spread the word in the cities. Rumors will spread. The barons don't like it when their dirty laundry is aired in the markets. Public pressure is a weapon no less effective than a sword. Ethan agreed. A week was spent on preparations. The forest was mined with traps all over again. The palisade was reinforced. Behind it lay earthwork. A moat. Not deep. But it would slow them down. Bree assigned the militiamen to their sectors. Mayrin forged non-stop. The symmetry smoked day and night. Harold worked alongside his daughter. The old blacksmith struck the anvil so hard it rang out. Soyon prepared bandages and medicine. Hazel kept track of arrows, bolts, and supplies. Annika organized the women. Water, food, fire. The children were in the far house. The enemy arrived at dawn. 100 armored warriors. The banners of 2 baronies. Havelock Marsh rode ahead on horseback, a piece of paper in his hand. He rode up to the palisade alone. He unfolded the paper. He began to read. A letter from Baron Kaltwasser, declaring the Free District illegal, ordering the confiscation of lands, demanding that the rebels be handed over to the Baron's court. He read it politely, with a half smile, with damp fingers. His voice was even and calm, like that of a man reading a shopping list. Ethan stood behind the stockade, watching at Havelock. Havelock finished reading. He rolled up the paper. He looked at Ethan. He waited. The battle lasted 5 days, not 3. 5. The forest worked. The traps worked. The crossbows worked. The militiamen retreated, fighting back. The armored soldiers got bogged down in the snares and pits. Casualties every day, on both sides. The militiamen had 7 wounded. 1 was seriously injured. Soyon never left the wounded. She bandaged them. She gave them herbal teas to drink. She staunched the bleeding with yarrow. She hadn't slept for 3 days. The armored soldiers suffered heavier losses. 12 wounded, 3 critically. The horses were limping from the traps. The supply train was stuck in a snare. On the 4th day, it began to rain. Cold, autumn rain. The Baron's camp was submerged in mud. The campfires were dying out. Food was running out. On the 5th day, Ethan did what he did best. He didn't fight. He fed them. That night, Annika and Greta baked bread. A lot of it, 20 loaves. Ethan emerged from the forest carrying a white rag flag, with a cartload of bread, with a barrel of smoked meat, with a barrel of water. He drove up to the Baron's camp. The sentries crossed their spears. Ethan said he'd brought food, for the wounded, for anyone who was hungry, no strings attached. The commander came out. Not the old knight from last time, a different one. Younger, tougher, but tired. Worn out by 5 days in the mud and rain. He looked at the bread, at the meat, at Ethan, and he asked why. Ethan said the same thing he'd said a year ago. He said he didn't want to kill. That the commander's soldiers had families. That no one needed this war except for 2 barons who were afraid of losing someone else's land. The commander was silent. Then he called for Havelock. Havelock approached. He looked at the bread. He looked at Ethan. And for the first time, his smile faded. He spoke quietly. He said that Ethan wasn't who he seemed to be, that he knew, that there had been others, before him, and they'd all ended up the same way. Ethan looked Havelock in the eyes, and he understood. Havelock knows. He knows about the time travelers. He knows about the notebook. He knows about everything. Maybe not the details, but the gist. The order, the barons, someone. They know that outsiders come into this world with foreign knowledge, and they eliminate them, generation after generation. Ethan stood before Havelock and felt a chill, not from the rain, from the realization. He was a target, from day one. Havelock hadn't come to count the yards. He'd come to check. Smoke from the smokehouse, strange knowledge, a plow with a blade. All of it was a signal, a warning bell. Another one had arrived. Another one is up to no good. He must be stopped. But Ethan wasn't J.H. from 1874. J.H. didn't have a community. He didn't have a militia. He didn't have 30 people ready to stand up for him. Ethan did. He looked at Havelock and said calmly that the Baron's law no longer applied here. Their law applied here. The law of the Free District of Mern. Havelock was silent. He watched. He assessed the situation. Then he pulled the Baron's decree from his breast pocket. That very one. The one about the confiscation of the lands. He handed it to Ethan. Ethan took it. He looked at the paper, at the Baron's seal, at Havelock's signature, and tore it, in half, then into quarters, then into tiny shreds. He threw it on the ground, into the rain. The shreds fell into the mud. They got soaked. Havelock watched this in silence. The commander watched. The soldiers watched. Ethan said, "Your law no longer applies here. Ours does." Havelock nodded, briefly. He turned around. He walked back to his tent. In the morning, the camp broke up. 100 armored soldiers marched south, wet, tired, hungry, with Ethan's bread in their bags. Ethan stood on the hill and watched them leave. Bree stood beside him, with a crossbow, with a bruise on her cheek. Bree looked at him and said he was crazy. Ethan said he knew. Bree snorted. Then she said that for the first time in 10 years, she didn't feel like hitting anyone. Ethan looked at her. Bree turned away, quickly. He walked down the hill. He headed for the gate. And just like a year ago, everyone was there to greet them. The whole community, all 32 of them, wet from the rain, weary from fear, alive, every single one of them. Lily ran first, as always. Tobias followed her, as always, serious, upright. Annika stood by the door with Ilum in her arms. The boy was 3 years old. He was waving a wooden spoon and shouting something joyful. Mayrin stood by the forge. Her face was black with soot. Her eyes were red from smoke and sleeplessness. She looked at Ethan and didn't smile, but in her eyes was something she would never put into words. Harold stood next to his daughter, a hammer in his hand. The old blacksmith who had chased Ethan away with a broom a year ago. He nodded. Just once. That was enough. Soyeon sat on the porch, exhausted to the point of collapse, her hands bandaged. She looked up and smiled quietly, tiredly. Hazel stood with the ledger. She held it to her chest like a shield. Her eyes were wet, not from the rain. Jenny wasn't there. She was in town, working, making a racket, doing what she did best. Ren stood by the fence, one-eyed, one-armed, alive. Tim and Olin beside him, dirty, cheerful. Willem No with his shoulder bandaged, Greta with her daughters. Martha with a pot of porridge. Just like back then, just like always. As if the porridge were her way of saying what she would never say with words. Tobias walked up to Ethan, looked at him, then hugged him, silently. For the first time in his life, Tobias hugged him first, on his own, without being asked. For no reason, he just hugged him. Ethan stood there and felt the small arms squeeze him, and how the whole war, all the pain, all the exhaustion, all the anxiety washed away from him like rainwater. He placed his hand on the boy's head. Tobias pressed himself closer. Ethan looked up. He looked out at the courtyard, at the houses, at the people, at the palisade beyond which lay his land, the fields, the forest, the river. 3 villages, the free district of Myrna, his. Not his as a possession, his as a home, as a place where he was expected, where breakfast was ready, where children ran to greet him, where the old blacksmith nodded to him as an equal, where the old woman brought porridge, where a woman served hot broth and, for a second, placed her palm over his hand. Home. He had a home. Not walls or a roof. People. Land. The same to say no to the Baron. And the knowledge that tomorrow he'll get up before dawn, and by the time the 2 little ones open their eyes, there'll already be something on the table. Ethan put his hand in his breast pocket. He felt a wooden figurine, either a wolf or a dog, with crooked paws and a head that was too big. Warm, smooth. Worn smooth from 1,000 touches. The most beautiful thing he owned. He stood in the rain in the middle of the yard, holding his son in his arms and the figurine close to his heart. And he knew that he now had something he hadn't even had in his past life. He had a home backed by an entire land. And that land was his. Not because he had conquered it, but because he had fixed it.